Hello, everyone. My name is Kelsey Zile, and I lead sustainability globally for AWS Data Exchange. AWS Data Exchange is an AWS service that makes it easy to find, subscribe to, and use third-party data in the cloud. In response to the growing focus on sustainability that we are hearing from our customers across verticals, including financial services, we began to work to unlock an array of sustainability research, innovation, and investing use cases by expanding the selection of sustainability-related data products, including environmental, social, and governance data available on AWS Data Exchange. Environmental, social, and governance ESG data, such as carbon scoring and emissions data, is increasingly important for financial service institutions and corporations who are looking to assess portfolio risk, meet specific investment mandates that align with the values of their customers, or report on the sustainability of their portfolio. So far, AWS Data Exchange has onboarded over 20 ESG data products, representing third-party scores, raw company-level ESG metrics, and reporting frameworks. Examples include SASB's Sustainability Industry Classification Systems global mapping data, SRAY ESG and CG scores from Arabesque, and an ESG data feed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average Company Universe from RepRisk. These products can be used to monitor ESG and business conduct issues related to clients, investments, and/or suppliers, to identify companies that may have violated policies or international standards, and/or benchmark a portfolio's carbon emissions. You can find this expanding offering of ESG and other sustainability-related data products on AWS Data Exchange by using the link below or by visiting AWS Marketplace, searching by ESG, and refining by data products. If you are working in the sustainable finance space, please check out the ESG data products available on AWS Data Exchange or request additional selection and learn more about the AWS Data Exchange service by visiting our sustainability landing page.
No matter what anyone says, in alternative data, finding signal is hard. As the leader in the space, BattleFin is driving the future of alternative data sales with something we call exploration kits. Exploration kits are like data roadmaps designed by you and hosted on Ensemble. These kits show buyers how best to use your data in a practical sense. Creating one will accelerate your sales process because they help data buyers understand what they're looking at faster. And because they're hosted inside BattleFin's Ensemble platform, you can leverage fundamental and reference data from Refinitiv, as well as combine multiple data sets to unlock and find real alpha. Give examples, use cases, and build models that highlight the power and alpha generating capability of your data. Every data set is different, so there's no template we can share for building a toolkit. But the process of starting your exploration toolkit on Ensemble is very simple. Just log into Ensemble, navigate to the Sandbox tab, click the plus symbol, and create a new Python 3 notebook. This is the interactive computational environment where you describe and illustrate the steps data buyers can take to access your data's insights. For example, you might start with a code to have Ensemble pull your data set into the sandbox. Now maybe you pull in some reference data and limit that to a certain time frame. Now combine those two sets into a table and create a delta column. You get the idea. You're literally giving them the codes and sequence of steps they need to analyze and understand your dataset faster. Simple, right? Look, the alternative data space is evolving. It takes a lot more than conversations to close deals. If you're interested in accelerating your sales cycle, BattleFin believes exploration kits are your answer. For more information, visit battlefin.com.
Wow, welcome everybody. Coming to you again from our new office in Sono, Connecticut. Excited to actually be back in the real world, driving a car, going to work. This is going to be amazing. So for those of you who didn't tune in yesterday, you missed a ton of great ESG content, but we'll have that available in a couple of days, so please reach out. We're on to day 2. It always gives me a lot of pleasure to thank the amazing sponsors we have. The AWS Data Exchange team has been absolutely awesome. It's always great to work with people that are committed to such an important topic, sustainability. This is a really important movement, and we're excited to be behind it and working with really, we think, the best partners in the world. That includes Refinitiv and Jefferies. And really today we have an awesome list of content and speakers that are going to really tackle some of the amazing, tough topics that are out there in the space. As always, make sure to use your Ensemble platform so that you can get the most out of these. If something strikes you as interesting, if there's a company that you want to meet with, log into Ensemble, click on the request meeting button, fill in what you're looking for. That way, a lot of these data providers can come to the virtual meetings and really be as efficient as possible. Because in the end, we want you getting actionable insights out of these. We want you coming out with a lot of value. So let's kick it over to our first panel with Layla. We're coming to you from the Spheres, a really cool office setup out in Seattle. So take it away, Layla.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, open source climate data and risk models. Why, what, and who? Joining our panel today, James Sallow, Head of Environmental Research and ESG Modeling at S&P Global. Houston Baltzel, Planning Team Member at OS Climate and President of Helios Exchange. Adrian Cockcroft, VP of Cloud Architecture Strategy at AWS. And now, please welcome your moderator, Layla Javidova from Allianz.
Great. Well, good morning and good evening for those who are based in Europe. For me, it's going to be Munich, and welcome to the open source climate data and risk model session. So I'm very excited to be the moderator for this session. And I think in the next 30 minutes, or I hope we're going to have a lively discussion on the different data solutions. And before we kick it off, I would like to introduce our panel first. So we have with us James Sallow, Head of Environmental Research and ESG Modeling at S&P Global. Welcome. We have Houston Baltzel, Planning Team Member at OS Climate and President of Helios Exchange. Welcome. And we have Adrian Cockcroft, VP of Cloud Architecture Strategy at AWS. So welcome to you too, and I will be your moderator for this session. I am a co-lead for internal climate solutions at Allianz Investment Management. So maybe before we start our discussion, I could give a little bit background on from the asset owner perspective on why we're saying that an open source solution I would say is transformative and is useful for the whole industry. In fact, basically, as a global financial institution and as an asset owner, we recognize the fact that to do the transition to a low carbon economy, to decarbonize the proprietary investment portfolio, we definitely need sophisticated climate data. So, and that is going beyond just emission data or company target data, but really focusing on, specific sector-specific data, forward-looking data, and really, it can be intensity data or capacity data. There's so much that is out there that is important when making an investment decision. So many climate-relevant KPIs and data that are not available at this point, or where we have, I would say, a low data quality or data coverage, and tools such as, portfolio temperature, portfolio alignment tools, or physical risk models that are needed, or that we need basically to integrate into our investment decision making. And when we, do our analysis internally, what we notice is that there is a whole palette of what you can do in terms of, in terms of when we're exploring climate data. And what we understood that there are really a wide range of organizations, institutions, experts working on the same problem, working on the same solutions and the same tools. And hence, really an open source platform can be really powerful because it can bring together all these, all this expertise. It can help us or enable a fair, I would say, and transparent access to data, and really help to join forces in order to work together on these problems, on these data gaps, and really enhance these tools that are needed for portfolio steering purposes. So this said, we support such a solution because we think it's just not just transformative and helpful just for us as an organization, but also to different companies, regulator, and institutions. So with this said, I would like to open our panel, and I would turn to you, Hussein, to tell us a little bit more on the concept of open source and just to give us a little bit more background on the topic.
Thank you, Leila. Well, I start by saying it's at the highest level. We collectively need to work very hard over the next 10 years to transform our economy to be truly sustainable from a climate perspective. So an important part of this is to transform how investments are made. And to do that, we need to get to do a better job connecting climate data and modeling to the financial sector at the point where investment decisions are made. And certainly you and Jamie are both very much in the middle of that. So I'm going to show a slide that shows a little bit of this sort of ecosystem that we're in in terms of climate data and then modeling, et cetera, and then the sort of financial system that we're addressing. So basically, the users of this are at the top of the slide where we have investors, asset owners, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, et cetera. They are the users of data and they're making the investment decisions. Some of them are very large and have a lot of resources. Some of them are not as large, but those are the ones who need to make the decisions on the point of making investments. And we have a lot of different entities serving them with all sorts of proprietary, useful data models, et cetera, functionality. At the bottom of this slide is basically things that are already open source and that are out there that are perhaps not fully connected through, but climate models, any number of analyses by think tanks, academia, nonprofits, et cetera. There is the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative data set, which is collecting a lot of really useful data. Some others we've indicated there, Rocky Mountain Institute, others, governmental data, et cetera. So, and actually data directly coming from companies through all sorts of disclosure that they currently have. So where we are in this ecosystem now is that in the middle layer, we have some sort of things that are in a competitive layer right now and are moving to non-competitive. And by that, I mean, there's all sorts of work by lots of people, including entities like S&P, to collect this data, organize it, make it more useful, et cetera. And it is, there's a lot of effort by many different organizations to do that, and it's duplicative. So that's an area where we're really trying to look for cooperation and more efficiency in that middle layer to make it much more open, more efficient, faster, better, more solid, cheaper, et cetera. And that's really the focus of the open source component, and it's why this is a good open source project. So the complexity of climate change is a good target. It is open source has been well used in biotech, in the Human Genome Project, et cetera. This is another complex project where an open source approach can be useful.
Great, thank you. I would really find it interesting. Maybe I could turn to you, James, because you are, as I said, lead for environmental research at S&P. What would you see as the main, I would say, use cases for from your perspective, for an open source solution?
Yeah, so S&P Global has been involved at an early stage with OS Climate as a supporter. And as you look at S&P's mission, we're looking to provide essential intelligence to the market and for an ever-changing world through our data and analytics insights. And being able to provide markets with information they need to make decisions quickly and with confidence. In order to do that, you need to have high quality, robust information that's widely available. At S&P through TrueCost, which is where I came to S&P through, we have a long heritage over the last couple of decades working and trying to pull this kind of climate and environmental data out of a vast array of sources of information. As Houston referred to, this is a lot of work to bring this information in and to cleanse that information. But there's also been a challenge that organizations have faced, which is just a lack of the information being there. So we're involved in the organization to both help bring out greater amounts of disclosure from companies that can be used for analytical tools and solutions, and also to help standardize and create more universal ways to actually report this information to help inform the market. And ultimately, this better availability of information and better standardization of information will allow to go from this pre-competitive information market to being able to utilize this information for a wide variety of analytical outputs and thought leadership. So that's one of the primary interest areas and very supportive of the OS Climate mission.
Great. No, great to hear that. And I hear a lot of how do I say, the wide range of the products and tools and data probably require a really sophisticated technical setup and automatization of many of these data sources and reporting. And then I would assume, Adrian, maybe you could tell us a little bit more, because you are working exactly on these type of topics, on the optimization of technology and automatization. How do you see your basically role in this open source data solution?
Thanks as well. I think going back maybe over 5 years ago, we had customers at AWS that were storing some very large data sets in S3, a storage service, in the petabyte scale. And they wanted to share those data sets, and the data sets are for the public good. So we started an open data initiative many years ago for all kinds of data. And over time, there's things like you can get weather data, climate data, or all kinds of data sets. So if you have a data set that's basically for the public good, you can apply to AWS. And we don't copy the data and manage it ourselves. The customer actually owns the data. So NOAA or the UK Met Office or whatever, they own the data. They have it in their own AWS account. But when they share it with the world, we set up a program that subsidizes the storage and access costs of that data. So it doesn't cost them anything to share that data. That's a subsidy program that AWS put together. And then in 2018, we built a particularly focused subset around climate. There's a lot of NOAA data in there. There's CMIP6 has been added. And that, particularly for these physical data sets, they're petabytes of data. And we set up the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative to encourage hosting the data in there. But these are just data sets. And then people come along and they say, great, now I have free access to this data. I can do all the processing. It reduces the cost of access to these huge data sets greatly. But when we try and join them together, we find that we have to do cleanup, because the very first time you go to use data, you discover you have to massage it, you have to clean it up. You're trying to join it with another data set. It doesn't quite fit for various reasons. And one of the things that became apparent was that one of the opportunities where there was climate was to have the models that actually combine this data together. And those models then cause us to go and modify the data that we're sharing in ASDI, so that we've got a pre-cleaned up data set which everyone has agreed is the right form. It's in the right format. It's got the right fields in it. It's being updated continuously at the right rate. And the models are there to basically ensure that we've got the data cleanup has happened. I'm sure if you've seen any data you've never actually tried to use, the first time you use it, you discover it's not actually what you want. So we're trying to get, that's been sort of how AWS got involved. We were already running this program. We started talking to OS Climate, and we got involved out of that ASDI program. Personally, I got involved because there's a Linux Foundation event organization, and I've previously worked on open source at AWS and have joined Linux Foundation organizations, Apache Software Foundation. So I was familiar with the process for working with a foundation, and joined with Anna Pinero-Pavet, who runs the ASDI. And the two of us basically convinced AWS to join OS Climate and also to sponsor it as the primary technical partner. So to do that, we're providing credits for compute use to run these models and do the conversion required. And we're also providing professional services resources to help build the initial data commons, the initial data lake that puts this together.
Yes, and I think that's what I was wondering as well, is basically seems like there's a wide range of topics here and data and tools, and the question was really how to bring all of this together into a platform. And I think you really partially answered that question. And I would ask maybe James if you could tell us a little bit more on the type of data that you think should be on that platform, on such a platform from from your perspective, and how we could really bring all of this together. How does it basically make sense in a bigger picture?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, right now there's a huge amount of information that's available, but it's available in a wide variety of sources, and it's being brought together by many different players to then clean up, make consistent, put their value add on top of it, and then provide to clients. So doing this work of actually creating a data commons where you are creating a curated pre-competitive library of climate and broader ESG data that's been aggregated that can be used as a public good that can then be incorporated or utilized in analytical tools and research is exciting. So when you think about the kinds of information that could be brought into this, it's quite broad. I mean, certainly you have the application of company provided information on their own climate or broader ESG environmental performance, but you can also have larger data sets that Adrian was talking about, where you could potentially bring in sources. There's many different public inventories of information coming from government agencies, from NGOs that could be brought together, and then when you have a communal source, it's very useful for people and groups who are looking to overlay intelligence on top of that, to have a curated source of information that you can then combine into analytics.
No, absolutely agree, because just maybe a simple example, if you look at, at the beginning I said, this is probably shouldn't be just a platform that brings together just emission data and company targets, right? There's so much more to that if you want to really, if we're talking about decarbonization. So I think sector-specific data is so crucial, and really notice that if you look just simply at, let's say, renewable capacities, there's so many institutions that have public databases on renewable capacity. Some are focusing specifically, let's say, on the US market, some are focusing on Europe, but there's no connection. And I really think that, and this type of KPI is quite important when, let's say, analyzing the utility sector, which is one of the hard to abate sectors, or considered one of the hard to abate sectors. So bringing that together, really that database together into one platform, can be really useful for many market participants. And maybe that brings me to to you, Houston, if you could just give us a little bit an overview also of the different participants on the platform, and because it seems like really it's a very diverse palette, right, of things we can do. So could you please?
Thanks. Let me review some of the members, and then I'll show you a diagram that sort of puts all of this together. So right now we have as members those present. So Allianz is a huge insurance company and asset owner and asset manager, and Standard & Poor's is both a huge rating entity, also a big data provider, and has a very strong ESG unit and index provider. And the AWS obviously is bringing the tech platform as well as the sustainability initiative. So we have others in those same categories. So we have Microsoft as a member doing tech work as well, but also will be an example of a corporate user who will supply data to the platform. So we have a whole initiative to get companies to provide data directly into the platform so that rather than in PDFs and other formats that they currently disclose. So Microsoft will use itself as a guinea pig to develop an upload tool for that. We have Jupiter Intelligence as a partner. That's a company that looks at physical risk. It brings in climate modeling. So we're connecting that through. We have other financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Federated Hermes. So those are, again, examples of users, big institutions that want this data and want to have it be faster, better, more accurate, et cetera. So it's that sort of consortium that we're putting together. And I'll show you basically the schematic of what's going on this slide. It's a little bit busy, but essentially we have a data commons or data lake that we've been talking about. We have users over to the right, which would be either directly through a platform or through APIs or through other means. And those could be either big institutions or back to the S&Ps and others of the world themselves to use elsewhere, or direct access by the public or smaller fund managers, et cetera. And then over on the left side of the diagram, essentially, where does data come from? Ungroomed, public, private, all sorts of areas in different formats coming into the commons, and then needing to be connected in the commons between having the data cleaned up, transformed in ways that can be made useful to the financial tools, and also the interconnectivity of, for example, physical assets with lat-long locations so they can be mapped and measured against physical risk. And also, so ownership data, mapping that up to parents through parent-child maps, and then mapping those parents to different types of securities. So this is the kind of activity that goes on all the time inside S&P and inside Allianz and other places. But there's a lot of duplicated effort there. And what we're trying to do is improve all of this plumbing and make it more open and free and faster so that all of those entities can then focus on even the harder problems of analyzing that data. So that's the general model. And then where we are specifically right now is that we are in the middle of 2-week sprints over the next 90 days to show what we can do in this area and bring in these different parts. So this diagram shows physical risk coming in from Jupiter, public and private data coming in from places like the Environmental Protection Agency, and ultimately portfolio data coming in and out from companies. So that's kind of the state of play right now, and we're actually hard at work on that 90-day plan, and with, as I said, 2-week sprints. And code going into GitHub, which is ultimately the way an open source project shows that it's making progress.
Great. But what I hear also from that, really a great, I would say, group of participants and experts on one platform, definitely will have some multiplier effect once collaboration takes place. But what I was wondering also, it seems like you have also many for-profit organizations participating on the platform. So maybe just first a question to you, Hussein. How do you think that fits to the open source model, which is basically, open access, or gets you an open access to the data? What is the role basically of for-profit organizations in this?
Well, I'll refer back to the first slide and then also defer to Jamie and Adrian. But essentially, in the open source world, there are lots of examples of nonprofit and then for-profit activity. In fact, Linux itself was in an open source, yet Red Hat built on top of that a business that was ultimately worth $34 billion when IBM bought it. So in this slide, we show this kind of middle area where we're trying to work together to have more efficient data. And if there are a lot of entities that are collecting it, even if they're for profit, and even if they are making some money from that as part of their service, it's probably not their best use of time if they have to do it over and over again. All things being equal, it would be way better for them to have a cleaner data set and then do a lot more with it. So you can even make the analogy to the Securities and Exchange Commission EDGAR filings. So those are all the financial filings that are used, and they go into that database and then are widely used after that by lots of for-profit entities to build models, et cetera. So this is that layer above that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Adrian, could I also ask for your view on this topic?
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of work in cleaning up data. And one of the problems we've seen is that if let's say you're an organization trying to produce your ESG report, you go out to a number of different specialist data providers to come up with different aspects of what you need. Each of those data providers may have started with the same raw underlying data and then cleaned it up differently because there's different grid resolutions, there's different timescales, there's many ways in which you can take the same data set and they come up with results that aren't actually comparable at the end of the day. So there's sort of a built-in problem here that we're cleaning up the data over and over again. So the first thing really is to come up with an agreed data set that everyone can use that has had all of the sort of processing done. And what we're doing from this sort of difference between, like, take for example, what we're doing with Jupyter Intelligence, the data set they're contributing into the data commons is a relatively low resolution model, like a 30-kilometer square grid that is going to cover the whole world and have some risk attributes in it. And then if you go to them and you say, okay, that gives you some idea of what Jupyter Intelligence can do, so it acts kind of as an advertisement for their capabilities. If you want really fine-grained details with lots more risk capabilities, you can go and talk to them, and they then will provide you, with a commercial solution that gives the particular data you want in the particular regions you want. So that's kind of the way to think about this. If you're a commercial organization, you figure out what is the sort of low resolution data set you can release into the data commons as kind of a public advert for the capabilities you can do. And then you get to build the real high resolution thing on top for what most corporate use cases would actually need.
So Adrian, is it a little bit about setting the right standards in the market, or showing what is the best solution, best in class solution?
I think we're trying to, so that we're looking at trying to bring in partners that are complementary. So there's physical risk. Jupyter Intelligence particularly has that area, and then we also have market risk, economic risk, and we also need a lot of data about companies. And if you just say, give me a stock ticker, that's a public company, where are their facilities in the world? That data in land registries is actually very hard to find because they have leased buildings, there's some of the addresses don't match up. There's a lot of data cleanup and a lot of things you have to do to really make it useful. So we're working on bringing this together. What we're really trying to do is take friction out of this. What we've been seeing recently is a huge increase in the interest in ESG, investment in ESG-based funds, and more interest from companies in reporting. And as companies want to report, we want to reduce the friction for them to report and give them more common ways of doing it so that we end up with a more rapid adoption of ESG reporting. That in itself gives the asset managers more to work with, and it creates this systemic feedback that causes more companies to be prepared to invest more in climate change. And I think the way I think about this is we've had a lot of interest recently, and this been working with many companies from the AWS side in digital transformation. It's one of those phrases you hear over and over again. What we're moving on to now, I think, is sustainability transformation. Right? We've done the speeding up development and moving to cloud and moving to dealing with the fact the internet is here. Now we have to deal with the fact that climate change is going to affect the markets and what is built by a huge number of organizations around the world. So what does a sustainability transformation look like?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And Leila, let me just follow up for 1 second to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
What we won't be doing in OS Climate is setting standards per se. So there are, in this area, there are so many frameworks by all sorts of different organizations, which are providing a lot of valuable insights, but it also is getting a little bit crazy. So you certainly have, Carbon Disclosure Project, which has been doing a great job over many years, collecting carbon data. And you also have the Global Reporting Initiative and the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board and a lot of other entities that are looking for data. I mean, stating how data should be used, typically not actually collecting it, or sometimes collecting it and then charging another fee for it. So what we're really trying to do is collect the data in an organized way, add value to it in the sense of standardizing units and other parameters to try to make it comparable the way Adrian was discussing. But we would think of it more as the bookshelf with a lot of information in it, but we would then map to those different frameworks. So again, from a corporate user standpoint, if corporations bring their data in and we can help map it to all of those different frameworks, that will be a big efficiency and a big added value to the marketplace. But we're not looking to set standards. That's just getting things organized is a way of setting standards somewhat, to say this is a forcing mechanism to say, look, everyone needs to look at this data, so we have to make sure it's in some kind of format that we can all look at it in.
Yes.
Yeah, we need implementations and ways to connect the standards, and that's what we've been working on.
Exactly. No, absolutely. But also maybe to you, James, I mean, S&P has already existing products and services you provide. How would you build upon using the open source solution?
Yeah, so this is a an interesting area of opportunity to look for abilities to be efficient and to scale rapidly. We're in a world where there's increasing amounts of data available that we can bring into analysis, and given the urgency around the climate crisis and the need and urgency for additional company reporting in this space, there's a huge amount of additional information that's being both demanded by users across the board, but also by the companies themselves to understand their own impact. So I'd say that in this, it's creating a differentiated layer of activity on top of the Houston said library. I refer to my 4-year-old daughter and think about building blocks and how the different pieces of, if you have some of this information that's being brought into a single location, or tools and models that are being brought in, that we can then put together, build upon, and add your own proprietary analytics and additional information to, you're creating potentially a tower, a castle that can kind of stand the broader test of time. So looking at this from a differentiated product perspective, I think is one of the key areas that we're looking to bring into the learnings that we've had in our own data collection, our own data cleansing, and hopefully in the future can build this out and have the work that OS Climate's had as a pre-competitive initial layer.
No, I like that analogy with the tower. Thank you. That would actually bring me to my final question, and I would say it's an open question to all of you. And maybe we can start with Houston, with you, a little bit about the product roadmap. Now we heard a lot of views, a lot of possibilities of what can be done. Is there a concrete roadmap out there that would be interesting to hear?
Yes, so I'll go back to one of my slides. Where we are now is looking for a 90-day deliverable, and that's why I mentioned the sprints that we're doing. So we're really focusing on a couple subsets. We need to establish the basic structure of the data commons, and this is where the Amazon team is doing the bulk of the work. And then we're bringing into that data commons the Jupyter Intelligence lower resolution data that Adrian talked about. And we're using some test data, but decent sized data to come in, showing facilities, showing carbon emissions, other things, primarily from US data sources just for the first step. And then we are using, we are linking everything to the legal entity identifiers that are used to understand parent and child relationships. And we're linking those to security identifiers so that we can upload an actual specific portfolio of investments with identifiers, have that mapped through to this data commons, have it connect to both carbon emissions and physical risk attributes, and have it delivered back to the user in some form or another. Ultimately, that might be APIs or other things, but this is the initial roadmap to get the basic plumbing working. And I think, Adrian, you could elaborate on what your team's doing.
Sure. So Amazon's quite well known for this process we call working backwards, where we start with the press release effectively for the thing that we'd like to have. What would that look like? Get everybody to agree that that is the end goal. So we're looking, in this particular case, we're looking at what is the initial release of this open source project. And you have to, there's a fine line between having it being underdeveloped, so it doesn't really give people a sense of, it's not really usable. People look at it and maybe say it's not baked enough to be useful, or overdeveloped, where it's kind of a lot of things are baked in and it's too hard to change, and maybe it isn't flexible enough to meet your needs. So we're trying to pick this, this sort of sweet spot where there's enough there that you can see what it wants to be, but it's still at a stage where we want to get more and more people to engage. So we've gone through, we have a facilitated program for doing innovation, working backwards engagements with customers. And we ran through that with the OS Climate group to come up with a clearer idea of what we wanted to have as our end goal. And we've created a number of work streams from that. Fairly obviously, there's one around data, like what data do we have? What data do we need? What do we need to do to the data sets we already do have? Maybe they need to be updated more frequently, or the format needs to be tweaked a little bit. So we're sort of working through this one work stream just around making sure the data is there and onboarding new data sets into ASGI driven by the needs of the OS Climate Data Commons. There's another whole work stream around the user interface. What is this going to look like, particularly to the analysts that want to really come along with a portfolio of stock tickers, of company corporate IDs, and say, what is the value of this? So how do we figure that out? And how do we make the commercial markets discoverable on top of the open source project? So there's a number of areas we're working on there. Then there's some work streams around integrating the various contributed models that we have from different organizations. And we're working with, obviously, Jupyter Intelligence and Ortec Finance. We're working with SASB. We're trying to work out how do we build all these interfaces. And then there's another work stream more around working backwards from the events where we need to work we need to work back from so that we have the marketing and messaging right. And there's a big push to go and sign up new members. So anyone out there that thinks this is interesting, really encourage you to get involved. We're looking for input, with contributions. We're having a lot of discussions right now with large organizations that are interested in either contributing technical resources, or they're representing the investor analyst community, or that represent organizations that want to do a better job of reporting their ESG.
Great. That sounds more like a call for action now from Adrian. Houston or James, would you like to support that as well? Maybe with James first.
Yeah, sure. Just very, very shortly. I think, now is the time. There's a huge urgency around this information, particularly for climate and greenhouse gas emissions. There's a need for greater disclosure of information in climate and environmental, and also to have the continued investment and advancement for data and analytical tools to better assess climate risks and opportunities. So I strongly encourage greater disclosure and involvement in helping to bring the information to bear that can be used to support these kind of analytics and to use these analyses.
Great, thank you, James. Houston, what about you?
Yeah, and I'll finish up by just saying thanks to everyone for joining this. But and our call to action is absolutely, if you're a fintech, data provider, other participants in this seminar, please get in touch with us. It may be that your own front offices, if you're with a financial institution, you may already be working with us. So let us know and we can find that out. You can contact us at os-climate.org. If you're an individual or interested in or have your own data, or with an academic or other organization, please go to os-climate.org and then contact us and let us know in what way you're interested in participating. And we'd love to increase that participation. Thanks very much for that.
No, absolutely. I'm very supportive of the initiative because really, as everyone already mentioned, we have the same issues, we see the same data gaps. And I think really by joining forces, we can really make a change. And I'm really looking forward to the collaboration, and I'm pretty sure in a couple of years, there will be definitely a significant value added through that this time frame, or this collaboration time frame. So yes, thank you very much to everyone for James, Adrienne, Houston, thank you very much for your input, for the great discussion. And I would say with this, I can close the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leila.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Leila, great. Thank you guys, and thank you to all the panelists. Next up, on top of the windmill, we're going to be going back and looking at cloud analytics and how this plays into the ESG space. So without further ado, we'll go to our next panel.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, cloud analytics for ESG big data. What are the top-ranked ESG sectors and companies, as well as insightful visualizations of ESG metric data? Joining us for the discussion is Bahar Gidwani, co-founder of CSR Hub. And now, please welcome your moderator, Solutions Architect from AWS, Colin Martin.
Hi Bahar, before we get started looking at the ESG data insights I've generated, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about CSR Hub, your goals and your purpose.
Well, there's been no easy way for consumers and businesses to discover how companies perform and compare on sustainability and corporate social responsibility, CSR issues. This makes it hard for people to make socially responsible decisions. It also makes it hard for people to decide which companies to support or not support, and where to work, whom to do business with, and so on. CSR Hub brings leading information about corporate social performance and puts it into one place so that business managers, professionals, researchers, academics, NGOs, online publications, social networking sites, and individuals can use CSR Hub's information to understand, share, discuss, and track the CSR and sustainability performance of companies.
Great, yeah. And this project has been my first chance to work directly with CSR Hub. And the depth and richness of the data set has been a real eye-opener to me. I saw that recently you added covalence data points and more of them to your aggregation. Can you give us a little idea around the other kinds of data sources that you're incorporating?
Well, thanks, Colin. It's been a pleasure also for us to work with you and the ADX team. We've been AWS users for 13 years, so we know and trust your work. We use data from socially responsible investing, SRI firms, which are also known as environment, social, and governance analysis firms. We use data from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, foundations, associations, activists. We use anything that we can find that will work to help people understand better sustainability. You can see a full list of our data sources on our site, and you can click through to learn more about them. And one of the benefits we bring is transparency. We give people access and understanding of what sources are available. Besides covalence, our major ESG sources, SRI sources, include ISS, Institutional Shareholders, MSCI, S&P's True Cost dataset, Moody's VE dataset, Ideal Ratings, and Arabesca's S-Ray.
Wow, a really broad selection. But one of the bits of feedback that I hear from our AWS customers is that ESG data often doesn't provide an apples to apples comparison. Different industries, sectors, and authorities have their own unique perspectives and priorities. So how does CSR Hub address those challenges?
Well, our goal is to provide consistent ratings of sustainability performance across a large number of companies. We didn't want to be trapped into rating only public companies, and some people have gotten there because they rely only on public filings. We also didn't want to interpret and impose ratings directly ourselves using our own team of analysts. We want our sources to be revealed and valued as they are, and we expect our ratings to reflect the general perception of a company's performance rather than a company's true performance. Now, these processes that we go through involve massive amounts of computation. Thanks to AWS, we're able to do that. We use our own big data algorithm, and we currently have more than 300 million data points in our system that touch more than 10,000 sustainability topics. So it's difficult to explain that methodology in 2 minutes. I think you'll have to go to our site to see more about it. We try to be transparent with our methodology, and we try to be transparent about our goals as well, our mission.
Yes, and that's certainly something that I've felt as a consumer of your data as well. So now let's take a quick look at the dashboard that I've created from CSR Hub's ESG dataset and see what kind of insights that we can derive. So this is the front page of my CSR Hub dashboard, and this front page is intended to act as the first view that our business analyst would have on the CSR Hub dataset. The analysis that I've done here is relatively simple. We've looked at aggregations and we've provided our audience with a means to conduct simple filters of the data. So as you can see, CSR Hub is broken down into 4 top-level aggregates: community, employee, governance, and environment. And what the CSR Hub dataset enables us to do is to be able to drill down on these top-level aggregates by region, country, sector, industry, or even individual country. So, as an example, if I were a business analyst looking for data points of interest in emerging markets, what we might be able to do is pick an emerging market that we know and trust and working regularly, like South Asia, and look at their top-level rankings, and then potentially look at another emerging market, say South America. And here we can get immediately a very visible indicator of potentially regions with greater levels of governance performance than other regions. So as an investment analysis, I'm able to curate a series of data points which might give me clues around organizations, regions, countries, sectors, or industries that it may be worth investigating further. So once we've found a region or a particular subset of the data that we're interested in, this dashboard gives us the ability to drill down into that data. So within that, we can see, as an example, the quorum. And by that, I mean what makes up this data. Currently, we're looking at a single region, but if we had a small sample, that may introduce bias into our analysis. So Using this quorum, we can identify small biases. Other things we might want to do would look at variability or volatility in this particular subset. So here we have an overall distribution of the market. And what this might tell us is that a particular industry or region is particularly volatile. So there is a risk that companies could be right down here in poor performance or right up here in high performance as well. And if we want a safe and reliable and consistent sector, we'd be looking for a lot more correlation around the kind of average performance here in the middle. And then finally, at the top of the screen, we have a chronology, which provides us with a view of the data over time. Moving down the sheet, this data provides us with lots of data points about individual metrics like the environment. But what we're really interested in is identifying the companies and industries below that are going to be data points which we want to further investigate. So in this example, I've taken that subset of data and I've plotted the top 100 performing companies overall. I've then taken that opportunity to plot them against the environment, community, governance, and right at the bottom here, the employee index. So what this enables companies to do, or individuals or analysts to do, is to take a look at their specific interest. So they may be interested in well-governed organizations that are concerned with environmental sustainability. So for organizations such as that, they're going to want to look at potentially the governance index and identify really strong performing companies by the color of the box, but also potentially identify organizations they might want to avoid or investigate due to the size of the box or the kind of red color of the box. Another interesting kind of feature of this particular sheet is I've looked to introduce some statistical analysis that CSR Hub have done in the past in white paper type form. So one particularly interesting piece of analysis that they've done is working out the balance between organisations that favour community focus versus organisations that favour an employee focus. Worldwide, there is a balance between these organisations. Roughly 1/3 favour the employee, roughly 1/3 favour community, and the remaining third are balanced in their bias. And as you can see, that bias is played out in this particular subset in South America. Taking that particular bit of statistical modelling a little bit further, I've introduced a similar bias model, but this time in our preferred axis of environment and governance. So as you can see here, we now can say that organisations within this subset actually have a pronounced bias towards environmental sustainability versus governance. So as an analyst, it doesn't tell you much on the face of it, but it is certainly going to be an interesting data point for you to further analyse and potentially look at correlations with other alternative data sources, or maybe more traditional data, financial services data sources like business performance. So looking at individual subsets of data is really interesting, but most analysts want to be able to compare, whether that's comparing regions, countries, industries, or sectors. So the next 4 sheets on my tool is an opportunity for our audience to do just that. We've provided them with a sheet that will give them chronological performance within the individual sector in this example. It will give them the ability to filter individual sectors, and it will provide them with highlights and lowlights within these sectors. And these highlights and lowlights will be automatically generated every time that new data is provided to QuickSight. So in this example, our analysts can very quickly take a look and see that construction, engineering, healthcare, and multi-international industries are actually performing really well and may be areas that we wish to investigate some of those leading companies. Conversely, we can also see that travel, food, beverages, and tobacco, and education and government are actually in decline. So potentially, if we had investments there, we might want to look at correlation between this alternative data and business performance and see whether these lowlights are actually played out in terms of the bottom line. Other things that we do here is we enable our analysts to work in the traditional ways that they work. So here I've provided the overall historical ESG data as a table. And I've done that because analysts often have downstream processes, often have secondary tools and that they wish to include this data in. So an analyst using this data, this QuickSight dashboard, can quite quickly click this button and choose to export this data to CSV or to Excel to begin downstream processing. Currently, this just looks at the top level sector ratings. That's not going to give an investment analyst many clues in terms of individual companies that they want to go and look at. So this second table, which we've provides the overall 200 top performing companies within ESG, CSR Hub's ESG data set in this particular subset of data. So the benefit now is that our investment analysts can drill down to the individual company. They can export this data and they can look for things like historical trend data. So as you can see, we have long tail examples of strong performance here, but we also have some companies that have only 6 to 9 months kind of history in terms of their ESG performance. So we can also use the data to drill in and find out whether that's consistent, reliable, strong performance, or it's something that is potentially an indicator and something we can watch for a slightly longer period to gauge. Kind of coming back to these heat maps within these sectors, I've also kind of moved on that idea that we prefer well-governed organisations who are committed to environmental sustainability. So in these heat maps, first I've mapped employee against community, with the size of the box relating to the employee performance and the colour of the box relating to the community performance. So what this now allows us to do is see a size which represents the governance performance of that specific organisation, and also see the colour of the box, which represents the overall environmental performance. So as you can see now, we have a series of clues and data points that we can investigate in those top 100 performing companies for companies that may enhance our investment portfolio. Moving back to the top, we've now identified a series of data points for investigation. But let's say that our organisation already has an existing portfolio, and what they're looking to do now is actually compare the firms within their portfolio. And this brings us to our final sheet of the dashboard. Before we look at our portfolio summary, I'm just going to remove the filter for South America because we do not have any South American organisations in our portfolio. And we'll just move back to see the full portfolio data now. So on this particular sheet, I have provided a parameter, and that parameter lists a number of organisations who we're interested in. We'll call that our portfolio. So now on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the overall portfolio performance across all ESG ratings, and we'll be able to see the month-over-month change. So as you can see here, between April and May in 2020, we saw a 0.7% uplift in terms of our overall portfolio performance. Alongside that, we can also see our top level aggregate performance. So as you can see here, we have an environmental uplift of 0.2% and a governance uplift of 0.3%. So it actually seems that the performance improvements that we're seeing in employee and community are bolstering our top level aggregates that we prefer. So maybe we need to take some action to ensure that governance and environment are performing at the level we would expect within our portfolio. Staying with the left-hand side of the screen, I've used automated narratives within QuickSight. And these automated narratives are written in code. And what they do is allow us to conduct simple analysis on this data every single time that it's integrated into QuickSight. So as you can see here, I have a series of highlights around individual companies, sectors and industries. And this is with the overall ranking within the ESG data. I'm also able to highlight lowlights, so potentially low performing organisations again at the organisational, sector and industry level. Finally, I've provided a 4-month compound growth rate so we can understand whether our performance is improving or declining. And unfortunately in this, we're actually on a decline of minus 0.36%. So there is maybe something we need to do here just to rectify that ESG performance. Following on from that, idea that we care about the environment and governance, I've repeated these narratives, and this time they now focus instead on the overall ESG rating, they focus on the metrics that we care about the most. So the environment, and just below that, we can see governance. And now that we're looking at that, we can see some interesting quirks of the data. So the first thing I would point out is, let's take a look at utilities here. So we can see utilities has been performing well in the governance arena. We can't see any particular performance in environment, but we can see at the top here, utilities is performing well. So we have a consistent performer there. Contrasting that, we can see healthcare here. And unfortunately, healthcare overall within the portfolio was on a downward kind of trajectory. But if we begin to look at environment, we can see healthcare is performing well here. And if we look at governance, we can see as a sector, it's performing well there. So as an audience, as a reader of this particular document, we now know that yes, healthcare is performing well or performing badly, and it may be propped up by the employee or the community ratings. So potentially another area to investigate. Moving quickly to the right, we've provided a chronology of all of our different sectors, so we can see how individual sectors are performing. And we've also provided some line graphs around top level aggregate performance. So we can see whether there's a sharp decline in any of our top level aggregates. Finally, I've used the scatter plots just as a really simple visual indicator of risk. So we've stuck with our idea that we have a primary axis of environment and governance that we care about. And we want all of these firms that sit within our portfolio to broadly be between this 60 to 80 point here and this 60 to 80 point here, because this represents really strong positive performance. So now this scatter plot gives me clues as to outliers within my data set and a series of data points to go and check, because potentially they represent risk to my portfolio and potentially my customers. And that brings us to our secondary axis. And this is our first opportunity to look at the detailed metrics that underpin the top level aggregates. So far in the 6 sheets or so, we've only looked at the top level aggregates. Below those aggregates are a series of ratings. So I've plotted here the environment top level ranking against our human rights and supply chain rating. And that is one of the ratings that goes towards the top level community rating. So as you can see, we still have a really strong, consistent base of performance in this 60 to 80 area, which represents really good performance. But now our outliers are even more pronounced, and we see some organizations who are really potentially underperforming in some of those key low-level metric areas that we really care about. And I've gone on and repeated that particular kind of secondary axis with a tertiary axis, this time looking at governance, but alongside that, the low-level metric for community development and philanthropy. Here, again, we can see a strong base of performance in that 60 to 80 mark, but a series of data points that we wish to investigate for potential of risk within our portfolio. To close the sheet and to close my demonstration, we've provided similar heat maps that you saw before that measure our primary accesses, so governance and environment, and our secondary low-level accesses. Rather than looking for strong performers in the top 200 companies, this time it's our own portfolio. So what we're doing here is looking at the bottom overall 100 performers. So the individual bits of data that we can see here, large boxes represent kind of less risk. So smaller boxes and darker colors represent organizations that potentially we may wish to investigate within the portfolio. And I've repeated these axes across the secondary and the tertiary accesses. Okay, well, thanks for taking a look at my QuickSight dashboard with me. Hopefully it's been a simple example of how you can use AWS's business intelligence tooling to gain insight on CSR Hub's ESG data. And getting started with ESG data can be challenging due to its size. Gathering, processing data can take a lot of horsepower. So I often recommend scalable serverless tools like EMR, AWS Glue, and like Amazon QuickSight that we just saw. Are there any recommendations from you on tooling that people should be looking at to get started, Bahar?
Yeah, Colin, that's a great question. We've thought about this a lot. We can deliver data in flat formats. We can even deliver it in HTML through our website, and we've integrated with Excel. But it seems a shame not to have access to the full richness and depth of our data set. So we've been pleased to see a growing number of people using our RESTful API. It has more than 220 endpoints. It exposes our AWS-based MySQL, MongoDB, and MonetDB data sets, which are all pretty unusual kinds of things to see out there in the marketplace. And it makes it easy to use Python or R and to use our data in notebooks. API users, interestingly, get access to 46,000 organizations instead of only 18,000.
Oh, wow.
Now, tools such as QuickSight and Redshift, anything that you can use from the tool part of Amazon just makes it so much easier. You can see, look at all the insights that you were able to glean as you went through all the, some parts of our data set, still just a tiny little bit of our data set. So we're excited. There's lots of opportunity, lots of tooling opportunity here.
Now, and you spoke just briefly then about some advanced kind of use cases. And I used very basic visualization techniques in my demo just to make it more accessible. We could have used anomaly detection, or we could have augmented our dashboard with SageMaker models maybe. And bringing machine learning closer to our consumers is the kind of tech that really excites me. What are you interested in right now though, Bahar?
Well, a lot of our investor users are doing machine learning and anomaly detection kind of stuff. We published in the Journal of Investing last year a paper that showed there are systematic inaccuracies and instabilities in ESG ratings. We showed that ratings revert systematically to the mean. So it's one of the first, I think, really broad-based data analysis papers. We had 30,000 points of data in our paper and a T-score, I think it was 72 or something. So people, I think, using our data can now start to get a lot deeper, a lot better answers about the things they're interested in. We've done measures of brand strength, credit rating, risk. We've looked at those things and we found interesting correlations in them. And now that we are rating the sustainability of government organizations, we can also do fun things, like we correlated our scores with the World Peace Index and the World Happiness Index. We've tied our scores to political spending, and we know whether Democrats and Republicans spend, Republican-led companies behave differently in sustainability. And we do work then as a result in various kinds of integrations into platforms that support investor relations, brand management, and supply chain management. So it's really getting to be a lot of fun. There's just a lot of places you can use a good data set. It's like a toolkit.
Oh, indeed, indeed. And I know you're very thoughtful about the use of your data and particularly its impact. There was a lasting thought for our audience on big data, cloud, analytics, ESG. What would that be?
It goes back to something I just said. I mean, we are thrilled that users of ESG are finally starting to deploy modern tools and technology. We built our site 13 years ago based on AWS. We use Ruby, we use S3, we use Amazon Big Data Servers. We edge load our pages and have one of the highest traffic sites in the sustainability area. And it all could not have been done if we didn't have AWS and its cloud and tools. Now we have starting to see ADX, Amazon Partner Network. We're starting to see people really promote this kind of data as an opportunity and give people access to alt data. And for instance, the fact that we used API 10 years ago, nobody else was using APIs. Now finally people are starting to offer RESTful APIs and starting to integrate them together. This means our data is going to be available for an even broader range of clients, used in more markets and applications, and that's really exciting for us. It means the tools and the technology have finally caught up on the user side. We had them on the data provider side. They're finally getting them on the user side, and thank you very much, Colin, to you and the ADX people and the AWS people for making it happen.
No, thanks, Bahar, for the opportunity to work with your data and to build out some ESG kind of dashboards that can show our customers exactly how valuable these tools and these data sets can be with their kind of analytics moving forward. So just to say, to close out, a big thank you for you to making the time, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Right, and thanks again to Amazon Data Exchange, ADX. I mean, they're really doing a great job here and making it easy for all of us ESG guys to tell the ESG story, the sustainability story that needs to be told.
That's our pleasure.
Great. Next up, we're going to tackle the legal and compliance side of ESG. And this will cover everything from greenwashing to do you have a culture of compliance, to what processes do you need to have in place to show that you're actually following a lot of these compliance guidelines. So let's turn it over to Mark Lopresti, and we'll get started with the compliance and legal panel.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, what changes are coming in 2021 and compliance around ESG. Lending his perspective to the topic is Peter Green, partner and vice chair for the Investment Management Group at Lowenstein Sandler. And now, please welcome your moderator, BattleFin's co-founder, Mark Lopresti.
Hello, folks, and welcome to BattleFin Day 2 ESG Data Extravaganza, hosted with our partners, Amazon and AWS. My name is Mark Lopresti. I'm co-founder of BattleFin, and I'm joined here by my friend and colleague, Peter Green. Peter's one of the best lawyers in the business when it comes to asset management, hedge funds, and their use of data and the compliance around the ingestion of data. Lots of news, of course, since we last tuned in. We had the GameStop madness, the Reddit-fueled frenzy in the market that sent the House and the Congressional Financial Services Committee into an absolute tizzy. We're going to talk about how that impacts the data industry, what it means to ESG, but we're going to start first by talking about what does it mean for the data industry, both on the buy side and the sell side, to have ESG quality data, and what does it mean for data buyers to have ESG data purchasing policies. Peter, what are your thoughts?
I can tell you that just by way of backdrop. Probably once a week, I get a call from a client who says, all right, I got to have an ESG policy. Not really all that sure what it means. And certainly some clients are knowledgeable on it, but some say, I need to figure out what that means for me. What does it mean for my organization? And why are they calling? Most of the time, they're calling because their sophisticated institutional capital has said, hey, new DDQ question for you, new follow-up question for you, checking in. What's the ESG situation over there? How are you complying? And so whether they like it or not, most fund managers need to communicate to their investors how ESG compliant they are. Now, of course, the devil is in that detail of what the heck does that even mean to be ESG compliant? Now let's move to your question. So I think, Mark, the really interesting thing, because we're still very much early innings on ESG, is what ESG means to one manager or to one investor, endowment, pension fund, is different than what it means to the next guy or gal, and so on down the line. And so I think what the industry needs, perhaps more than anything, is a sense of what does that mean? And I think you're probably going to get that over time, potentially from investors who start to demand, like they have with a whole bunch of other issues over the years, demand that their managers focus on ESG concerns when making investments. So then, of course, you get to, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to, in every trade that I put on, I have to have an ESG memo, or there needs to be an ESG overlay? That seems pretty cumbersome, right? And so it's going to mean different things for different managers. 5 years ago, Blue Harbor is a good example, right? There were managers out there who really cared about ESG and thought that the investing marketplace would move to ESG. And I think a lot of people probably said, oh, that's crazy. That's not going to happen. This ESG stuff, markets are about making money, managing a hedge fund is about one thing: generating return within the bounds of the law. People aren't going to take into account environmental, social, governance, DEI type issues when they do that. But now we've seen from the way our society's behaved over the last year is, well, yes, they are, because a lot of folks who wield a lot of power, that is the allocators, the endowments, the pension funds, are going to demand it. So then the question will become, well, what do you have to do? And that's what I think a lot of clients will say, well, what's the minimum? What do I have to do? And that'll be worked out to some extent at the beginning between manager and investor. And some managers will have to do more than others. I think those managers probably with strong, you may not agree with this, but with stronger track records and more leverage in the context of their relationship with their investors will have to do a lot less than others. Those maybe just coming a line and launching tomorrow, maybe they'll have to do a little more. And what it will mean is your analysts, and maybe it's new analysts, maybe you hire ESG analysts, right? So you don't have a software analyst and a tech analyst looking at ESG. You have a software analyst looking at software and a chip analyst looking at chips. And then you have an ESG overlay to all those investment recommendations by those analysts and investment decisions by the portfolio manager. But I do think hedge fund managers are going to have to start to add ESG knowledgeable folks to their teams. So when they make investment decisions, ESG is part of it. And then obviously, before you do that, you have to document. So you're going to document an ESG policy, 1 page, 2 page policy about, I'm oversimplifying it, but we care about ESG and it's part of our investment. Then you're probably going to have a desktop procedure for, hey, here's what we do to incorporate that ESG policy into every trading decision we make. And then you're going to need to have people on your staff who are able to incorporate those ESG factors and inputs into every trading decision you make. And you're going to have to document it, because you and I, Mark, know that the worst thing you can do is have a policy and then not really follow it or prove that you follow it. You're going to put a policy in place, then you follow it, then you're going to document so you can prove you followed it, and then you're going to be able to show on a model basis, on an example basis, your existing and prospective investors, hey, here's how we do it. You're going to have case studies. So you're going to have an ESG case study around governance concerns for your semiconductor portfolio. Here's how we look at governance. Here's how we look at the board of our companies to make sure we're comfortable that the board is independent, that the board is diverse, and that the board follows good process. And to date, managers cared about, earnings, fundamentals, foot traffic. Well, now there's something else they're going to need to add to that list. And it's not necessarily because all of them want to. Some of them want to. Some of them admirably will say, hey, that's really important. But irrespective of whether you want to or not, the sophisticated capital out there is moving towards, they're not there yet, is moving towards demanding. And then,
well, Peter, certainly, good.
I think then the next thing that you probably want to talk about is data as it relates to this. But let's hear where you were going.
I was going to say, I can tell you with 100% certainty that the last 2 or 3 institutional IMAs or seeding agreements that I've been involved in have had very specific ESG requirements with restricted lists, concentration limits, diversity requirements for boards, real specific and in the weeds. And yes, it varies based on the investor, but you're starting to see certain themes develop, right? And if you talk to people that are operating businesses in the defense industry or legacy oil and gas, they will tell you they're absolutely feeling the heat of the ESG pressure from the endowments, the pension funds, and the top institutions. How is that going to translate, if we can predict, how is that going to translate into data policies? What does it mean to have an ESG quality or qualified data policy?
So I agree with you. And we've had those sinner lists out there, right, for a while. Hey, don't buy gun stocks that are tied to child labor. That's sort of the precursor to all this, right? It was the beginning, close to the beginning of all this. And so we do see, I agree with you, just to touch on that point, we do see in side letters for sophisticated institutional investors, hey, you can't buy these stocks. Sometimes you can't buy altogether. Sometimes it's you can't buy more than and have it be more than X% of your portfolio. Or you could, but just essentially side pocket us out and don't give us exposure to those names. So the sinner list is around for a while, and it's a really good point you make, because it means that really ESG's been around for a while. Don't buy gun stocks. That's been out there for a long time for some investors. Don't buy alcohol stocks. It's been out there for a long time. So what will it mean for data? I think there's a lot of different data sets that this is going to spawn. The BattleFins of the world are going to be super juiced up about this, because data, more data, more data. I think some of it's easy data to collect, right? Diversity, independence of your board, DEI issues at your board, DEI issues at management. That's easy, right? Those are just stats. I think you're going to see the SEC mandate those stats out there more, right? I think you're going to see the SEC come over the top and talk about exactly what they want to see from a DEI perspective and governance perspective at the board level. So that'll be data that will be out there, and then someone's going to scrape it and put it together. Look, a lot of the data that's bought is just out there already. You and I could go find it. It would take us decades to find it and package it. What do the data folks do? They just make it really much more accessible for the manager, and that's what you're paying for in a lot of instances. It's not access; it's just organization and gathering and organization. So I think you'll see a lot of that. I think you'll see a lot of data sets that just pull data around DEI and governance. Then on the environmental side, that's trickier because that's not as much as I would say name, rank, and serial number as the DEI at the board level. It's not as easy to collect. I think on the environmental side, you're going to see managers. This is about being green, right? And so you're going to see data sets, I think you already do, where the data provider is going to give you an analysis as to how green a particular company is. And I think the way to do that, one of the ways to do that will be a scale. So, hey, let's look at all the names in this particular subsector and let's give them a rating for how green they are. And how are you going to do that? You're going to scour their reporting. You're going to scour the press. You're going to do research on your own into their factories and their, if it's a manufacturer in some sense. You're going to do research into their factories, the way they manufacture, where they get their raw materials. You're going to start to trace all that back, and you're going to say, okay, where did they buy the raw materials? Did they buy them from a place that's not green friendly? Did they buy them from a company that's not green friendly? So I think you're going to see managers spend a lot of money on that. Why are they going to spend a lot of money on that? Again, maybe this is cynical, but again, one of the reasons they're going to spend, not the only, but one of the reasons they're going to spend a lot of money on that is because they want to be able to show to their sophisticated prospective and existing investors, hey, here's what we're doing to make sure that we're investing in companies that are green. And if there are two companies that are of equal value from a fundamental financial perspective, sort of using old way of looking at things, and one is much better than the other at being green, whatever that means, well, then we're going to buy the one that is much better at being green.
Right. So, Peter, because I want to make sure we leave 10 minutes or so to cover some of the popular topics that you and I always cover on these sessions around best practices for data buyers, data sellers, the need for DDQs, compliance manuals, and all that. But I want to turn the conversation from the data buyer side of things to the data provider side of things. Of course, that's roughly half of our audience. What can data providers do, and what should they be thinking about in getting ahead of this and being able to show that their data gathering processes, because I think that's going to kind of be the focus, in my opinion, from an ESG perspective, is can you show that the way you're gathering your data isn't just compliant with not having HIPAA and MNPI and all of the, the alphabet list of bad stuff when it comes to the data world, but how are you showing me that your data gathering policies are ethical, right? That they follow good governance standards. Any view on what that's going to mean to the data providers?
A great question. And I'll tell you, literally, just yesterday, I had calls with two data providers. And so, as you know, my practice focuses buy side. I represent hedge fund managers in many aspects of their business, one of which is the purchase and consumption, the onboarding, purchase and consumption. And the reason I talk to vendors, don't usually represent vendors because don't want to conflict, want to be able to help and represent all my buy side clients when they are ready to diligence and buy data from vendor XYZ. But I will get calls from vendors from time to time who just want to pick my brain and say, help me formulate my product in such a way that I get to yes more quickly with your client base. Not any client in particular, but just get to yes more quickly. And to date, what has that meant? It's meant data provenance, privacy, and HIPAA, as you say, right? Those sorts of issues. But now there's definitely a new part to this, which is, hey, how do I show my client base that I'm ESG friendly, and how do I prove it to them so that when they diligence me and decide whether they will buy my data set, I can get to yes more quickly. So how will we do that? A couple ways. You and I will talk about compliance best practices later, but part of this is diligence and part of this is what does the contract say? On the what does the contract say? I think we're going to see contracts now have representations and warranties around ESG. I don't think we know what those will look like yet, but I think we're soon to start to see the buy side demand that the sell side, not the traditional sell side we think of, but the data vendors, that the data vendors make certain representations to the buy side as to what their ESG policies and procedures are. And I think that's two things, interestingly. One, and maybe this is where you were going, maybe it wasn't. You want your data provider itself to be ESG compliant to the extent that a data provider can be ESG compliant, right? So if you're selling ESG data, I hope your management is diverse, right? I hope you're not a bunch of 40-year-old straight white guys in the room. That probably doesn't help you when you tout yourself as an ESG data provider. So I think that's part of it. And then the other part of it is just the data itself. So we talked about what is the contract going to say? It's going to say something. Well, what does the diligence side of this look like? I think the diligence side of this looks like trial data sets, a compliance memo saying, hey, here's how we go about gathering ESG data, right? Here's our methodology for determining whether a company, a manufacturing company, for example, is green, not just, hey, they're 7 on a scale of 0 to 10. How do you get there? Because I think if you're going to be an ESG provider, you need to be ESG friendly yourself as an organization. And then your data, of course, needs to be ESG driven, but that's not enough. You need to be able to explain to people, well, how are you making your ESG calculations? What's your methodology?
And that's a good segue, Peter, into getting into our favorite topics, best practices for compliance programs on both the buy and the sell side. But before we go there, I'm going to offer an opinion that I have, at least as it relates to data aggregation policies. Data providers that tune in, and thank you for doing so, that tune into our BattleFin webinars and conferences, I don't think have too much to worry about in proving that their data gathering policies are ESG if they're following current regulation. If you're not spoofing identities to grab data, if you're not doing bad scraping, and we talk a lot about good scraping versus bad scraping, if you're not violating terms of use, if you're not trafficking an MNPI, PPI, or identifiable information, you're probably already, as far as your data aggregation methods are concerned, you're probably already ESG. But if you have a question about that, you know where to find Peter, you know where to find me. Peter, let's now talk about best practices. They continue to evolve. Last time we were together, we were talking about how this administration might impact that. Not that much since the last time we spoke in terms of news on that horizon. But I think it's important to spend a few minutes. Let's just go over, for the data buyers, the hedge funds, what are you in your practice? What are the basics that you're advising your clients to have in place?
Sure. So let's talk about the basics. And let's also start with, we know the staff, when they come in for routine exams now, Mark, they're looking at this. We know every time, hey, what data are you buying? Show me your file on every vendor, right? The staff, more and more as time marches on, is going to want to see what does your file look like. So what should it look like? What's the best practice for giving the staff a file for each data vendor? So the first is diligence. Just first step, what you learn about the vendor when you do your research, and this is really on the data scientist side is where it starts, right? The data scientist says, oh, I heard about this great new data set, and they go to compliance and legal. But they don't usually go to compliance and legal until they've diligenced the vendor some. They understand what the data is, what they're buying, why will it help. So you should have some sort of memo that explains the business case, right? That should be in your file. Then once the data scientist says, well, I like the business case here, this is a really good data set, I think it's worth it. Well, then what? Then the fun begins for the legal and compliance team, right? Then we need to do two things before we even get to the contract. One is we need to send a DDQ. Everyone's DDQ looks different. We've talked about this. Clients who have 20-page DDQs, clients who have 5-page DDQs. It depends on your organization, what you have the bandwidth to process, what you want to look like in the marketplace. There is no one size fits all. There won't be for a very long time, and that's okay. So have a DDQ, ask questions. The vendors now understand they're going to get a DDQ. They used to be much more bothered by it years ago. They know they have to do it now. They're going to fill it out. They're going to send it to you. Don't just throw it in the file. Hey, read it, right? Read the answers and see, is there anything here that's troubling? Any answer that raises even a yellow flag. If there is, you need to ask follow-up questions, and you probably need to talk to your outside. Then you get past the DDQ phase. And the DDQ talks about, where do you gather your data? How long's your organization been in business? How many employees do you have? Have you ever had a cease and desist letter? Are you the subject of any regulatory or litigation proceedings? What does your insurance look like? Some of these things are basics to any organization you would diligence, and some of them are, of course, like data provenance. Where do you get the data from? Data specific. Once you move past the DDQ phase and you're comfortable enough to move to the next phase, you're probably going to want to have a call. Now, you've already had a call on the business side, but now you want to have a legal compliance call with the company's probably internal compliance person. Sometimes they're external lawyer as well, which is great. They have external counsel, and that external counsel gets on the phone and explains how that external counsel is comfortable with the data provenance of the data that they're selling and you're considering buying. So we have our business diligence, we have our DDQ, we have our legal and compliance diligence. Then, once we've done all of those, right, once we've completed each of those steps, then we move on to the contract. And again, contract isn't much different. This is the same conversation, Mark, that you and I have. Changes around the margins time after time. What's important? They're garden variety contracts, right? Care about the indemnity. You care about auto termination. Those are probably the two non-data specific terms that you really should focus on. Obviously, the economics have to be right, but that's at a higher pay grade, for, so to speak, than the lawyer. But what does the lawyer care about more than anything else? The lawyer cares about data provenance and PII. And in that order, for sure. Let's make sure that we get representations and warranties from the provider of the data, where the provider of the data says, at every step along the way, from the person, if it's Mark Lopresti's credit card transaction data, from the person who creates the data, all the way, every link in the chain to the buyer of the data, that is pure, that is clean. And what I mean by that is that each person or entity in the chain has the right to sell it on or to transfer it on to the next person in the chain. And you've got to follow through every link in the chain from Mark Lopresti all the way to the hedge fund that buys the data. And you have to believe those representations and warranties, and then you have to see them in writing on a piece of paper that's signed by the other side. So that's legal concern number one. What's legal concern number two? As you know, it's PII. The great irony here continues to be hedge funds have no interest in PII whatsoever. They don't care about Mark Lopresti's name. I, of course, care about Mark Lopresti a lot, but they don't care about Mark Lopresti or who he is. They might care demographically who he is, right? That he's a white male, X age, but they don't care about what his name is or where he lives or what his social security number is. And by where he lives, I mean his exact address. They care geographically where he lives. And so what that means is you just need to make sure you get a good representation from the provider where the provider says, I will not give you any PII. And then you have to instruct and train your data science team internally. Hey, if you see PII, a stray social security number, a stray address, raise your hand right away, because we need to, one, go back to the data provider and say, hey, wait, what happened? You're not supposed to give us this. You need to reclean this data and resend it to us. And then we also have a compliance question that I get pretty regularly. We need to figure out, well, what do we do now, right? We have PII. That sounds terrible. We don't want PII. But that data set is arguably a book and record of the registered investment advisor. So we can't really destroy it, can we? So we have to decide, lesser of two evils. Do we destroy it? Probably not good. Or do we sandbox it somewhere, put it in on a server somewhere where no one can get to it except legal and compliance, and hold it there? And if we do that, what PII state level, and hopefully we'll get federal law on this eventually, but our federal government is busy. What state level laws do we need to comply with respect to that PII if we choose not to? So I know that's a lot to digest.
So that was great, and that was a concise overview. We've spent a lot of time on prior webinars more broadly on best practices, documentation, and diligence files, compliance files. I wanted to do it in a more condensed version today, so we're a little bit more topical. And to that end, Peter, I want to ask you a question, something that comes up in our business in BattleFin a fair amount. There are data sets and data providers out there that aren't willing to give because they cannot, by the very method of their data aggregation without nefarious intent, unable to provide the level of data quality reps and warranties that you just went over, and there's more, right? And yet you got a client that wants to buy the data set, or they want to advertise, or they want to have their data set hosted on Ensemble, and myself and my team go, ooh, how do we handle this one? What advice do you have?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a question we hear all the time. And as a lawyer, we know there are certain data sets, and after we do our diligence, say, Mark, this one's okay. It's fine. We've looked at it. We're satisfied. Every link in the chain looks good. We got excerpts from contracts at every link in the chain. This data set is pure from a data provenance perspective. Go ahead. Then there are data sets where you say, yeah, we think it's okay. Maybe we can't prove every link in the chain, but we don't have any reason to suspect that it's a problem. Those seem okay too. And then the third bucket is, yeah, not only can't we prove every link in the chain is okay, but there are a couple links in the chain where we see some language here that makes us think, I don't see how it's okay. That link in the chain is broken. And I think without naming names of vendors and such, every client has a different level of risk tolerance. You and I know we haven't seen an alternative data case yet around MNPI.
Right.
We will see one. It will be, as is, I think, often the case when the staff first makes its way, or the government first makes its way into a particular area. It will be an egregious case. And so it's risk tolerance. I think some clients, especially larger clients, ironically, who know that they are a sexier target above the fold for a regulator to say, I got so-and-so, they're probably more conservative, rightfully so and understandably so. Whereas smaller clients might, yeah, I understand there's a modest level of risk here. You can't tell me it's perfect, but it seems like a lot of other people are buying this data set. You sort of get that, what you say to your mom and dad when they say you can't do something. Well, everyone else is doing it. And we'll say to clients pretty regularly, I get that everybody else is doing it, but I can't, just looking at the absolute words on a page, I can't tell you that it's okay.
The jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge excuse, just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean you should. You should be too.
Here's what I would say. I would say our client base is pretty obedient here. And I know the other practitioners in this space as well. There aren't many, and we, keep tabs on what the other and others are doing, just to make sure we're all sort of rowing in the same direction, which is good for the industry, and that collaboration makes sense.
Absolutely.
I think that clients are becoming increasingly more careful. If there's a broken link they don't buy it. And you know what? No single data set's going to make or break your investment philosophy or your performance or your strategy. And I think a lot of clients say, you know what, if this one's not perfect, I'm not buying. And some clients say, well, you know what, it's not definitely broken. The link's not definitely broken. I think it's okay. And that's okay. I have with my clients, not with respect to data, with respect to everything, what I call the baseball bat category. Something falls into the baseball bat category. If you want to do it, and I say, there's no way I'm letting you do it. And you say, well, but it seems okay. And I say, I have to come over to your office with a baseball bat because you're not doing it. And I think if there are 100,
I love that. Very subtle.
I think 100 data sets, Mark, there's probably one or two that fall into the baseball bat category. And I really do think the industry has matured. It has learned so much about this, and they're not buying those one or two data sets because two reasons. One, no single data set's going to make or break you. And two, you know what? You could probably, Mark, triangulate through other data sets to most of what's in that bad broken link in the chain, 2 out of 100 data set. If you look at 2 or 3 other providers, maybe it's not perfect. Maybe you don't get everything you need, but you are careful and you're risk averse. And you know what that also does, Mark? It's like showing a restricted list to the government when they come in and say, what's your MNPI process? So if they come in and say, where's your restricted list? And you say, oh, I have one, but there are no names on it. They're going to say, well, I'm not quite sure you have a really good MNPI process here. There's never been a name on your restricted list. And so just like we talked about that file for every data vendor, you want that file for the 1 or 2 you reject from a compliance perspective as well. Because it shows real process to the staff when they come in, and you can say to them, you know what? We just couldn't get comfortable with these two. These two were troubling to us. So they're in the files. Maybe we'll be able to get comfortable one day down the road, but we're not there yet. And I think that's a really important part of this process, and it's a really important thing for people to remember. So if you can't get comfortable with the data, that's okay.
Show the rejects as well as the ones you accepted.
Guys, that's great. Peter, Mark, thank you for that. I'm sorry I got to cut you off. I know you guys could keep going. There's a lot of meat here that you can get into. That said, if anyone in the audience does want to meet with Peter or Mark to continue the discussion, we'll put that on the screen. You can set up meetings with those guys. Next, though, I want to turn it over to Svetla, and we're going to go to the next panel on disclosures. So take it away, Svetla.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, the state of ESG disclosures, challenges and opportunities, exploring the regulations behind ESG disclosures and learning how investors can gain actionable insights from them. Joining our panel today is Nathan Gabig, partner and ESG leader for banking and capital markets at KPMG. Jeff Cohen, director of capital markets integration at SASB. And Balaji Gopalan, principal solutions architect at AWS. And now, please welcome your moderator, partner development manager for AWS, Svetla Marinova.
Welcome everyone to our ESG panel, which is going to discuss the state of ESG disclosures, some of the challenges and opportunities in this space. I have three panelists here with me representing the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. This is Jeff, KPMG with Nate, and of course an AWS presence with one of my favorite SAs to work with, Balaji. So let's get right into it. Question number one is around the state of regulations. Let's first talk about what is the value of communicating disclosures, how are they communicated, and in terms of mandating disclosures, what is the state of affairs? Jeff, this is a question for you.
Thanks, Svetla. Thank you for having me. Very happy to address this. Ultimately, there is, with the exception of the progress that we're seeing in the EU, very little mandated regulation around disclosure of ESG or sustainability related data worldwide. So ultimately what you have is a relative cacophony of clamoring stakeholders looking for ESG information, some of which are investors, others are local communities, employees, customers, etc. So there's a lot of pressure and interest in company disclosing ESG information. And there is currently guidance from exchanges. 47 exchanges currently have guidance around ESG disclosure, but it is not mandatory. And there is, in fact, significant flexibility for companies to think about communicating financially material and decision useful information from an investor standpoint as it pertains to ESG. Now, there's a lot of other information that, as I mentioned before, is of interest. And the most important thing here is in the absence of regulated and mandated disclosure, companies can control their own narrative, and communicating effectively with investors through consistent comparable standards that can be leveraged in an investment process is a really effective way for them to meet the needs, the growing needs of investors looking for this type of information.
Thank you, Jeff. So we just covered how governments and regulators mandate disclosures, which they really don't. But oftentimes the market moves faster than regulators. And so what we're hearing from market participants, both companies and investors, is that they have an incentive to want to know more about portfolio companies in the case of investors, or companies are voluntarily disclosing. So the question here is, can we go into why are they in a rush to do more work or to communicate more than what they're asked for? And I welcome everyone to provide customer examples and what they're hearing in the market. Balaji, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm working with a lot of financial services firms. I think in terms of the large banks and investment banks, they want to be informed of developments and like trends that are happening in the area of like ESG disclosures. That's one thing you constantly see and hear. I constantly hear that. The other thing is like they want to compare like the peer disclosures, looking at like information gaps that they may have, any methodological concerns that have been identified by investors. They're also like looking at adopting or refining their own ESG policies, initiatives, and even like looking at voluntary disclosures, because these present a great opportunity and there is also a risk associated. So they're kind of treading that path. But if you ask like specifically, what I'm observing is stock exchanges have incorporated their own like ESG disclosures requirements for those that are listing on them. We're working with few of them. And then more specifically, we are seeing like customers like Morgan Stanley joining like the carbon accounting financials, NASDAQ launching their own ESG footprint, and even like JP Morgan Asset Management was saying, hey, I'm going to develop my proprietary model for rating comparisons. On our side, we also work with a lot of ISV partners. I mean, great partner of ours is SASB. We also work with NLP providers like Eminent Analytics. They have some interesting data sets in that space. This is also prompt us to actually think beyond, like, and respond and see how we can actually help our customers. In fact, we have a sustainability like landing page on our AWS Data Exchange, which is the marketplace for data. We have a lot of data partners also listed. We are also providing like referential like architecture patterns. If customers want to use this, how can they actually use? We have some recommended architecture patterns. And we're also working with the likes of KPMG in terms of seeing how we can develop mutual capabilities. So this is something that we are observing, and we are actually seeing how we can get ahead, help our customers.
Awesome. Thank you, Balaji. And Nate, from your perspective, can you share some examples of customers who are moving ahead of the curve, and what are they doing?
Yeah, no, why? Gladly. Thank you, Svetla and Balaji. That's a great way for me to dovetail in. You know, as the accountant here in the room, you know, we see this as a part of these disclosures as table stakes to be in the ESG market, right? Especially on the SASB framework and disclosure. The asset managers have different catalysts and reasons to be disclosing or ingesting data than do, like you mentioned, the investment banks or even private equity funds, because they too have found that there are specific premiums available in the market if they sell to a narrative, you know, that has a particular green, or the pandemic, a social, or through a COVID offering. But on the opposite end, if you lack that narrative, there's also something of a sting of the tail too, right? We've seen cost of capital increase for some of these parties that aren't disclosing. And, you know, in the example of, you know, most recent departure from the Dow, ExxonMobil being replaced, you know, by Salesforce, a AAA rated ESG security moving tens of billions. But I also think, Svetla, to close the point, the Biden administration, right? I think that's going to provide significant tailwind. We're seeing it already to our clients waking up and saying, it's just a matter of time. The new commissioners that have been put in place, there's an expectation that these new set of regs that'll come in alongside it are going to, you know, be developed rapidly. And once they're in the Federal Register, people really need to start adopting quickly.
Thank you, guys. So it seems like data is being disclosed, but what I want to know more about is how is this data actually being used, both from an investment analyst perspective and also from a technical perspective. Can you talk about some of the challenges and opportunities here? And Nate, let's get back to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And this is probably the most consistent thing. KPMG is a member of the Fixed Income Investor Network, and that consistent message we see is that the data is not yet comparable enough, or that the data is too costly for us to source ourselves. So, you know, a good example we've seen in some cases are asset managers or endowment. In other cases, we want to be invested only in ESG investment grade entities. So in that case, in a lot of cases, they'll say it's only BBB plus and above. So in those instances, they'll want to make sure that if they're looking at a company that doesn't quite make the cut, they can verify whether it's specific quantitative metrics coming out of SASB or other elements, that they are sure that before they make that decision to sell a stock or move out of a bond, that they have the right information, or they're making that right choice. And we're seeing that more and more frequently. You know, an example is there was a social media internet company that at one point was an ESG darling of sorts. They've been knocked down numerous times to the point where the rating agencies and aggregators, they've even been articles from portfolio managers clearly saying this company is not ESG friendly. They're selling data, lack of governance on executives, and other other ESG pejorative news items that have come out against them.
So Nate talked a little bit about ESG ratings, but I would like to turn it back to SASB. And Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the raw data that is driving these ratings? How is that coming together, and why do you pick the metrics that you pick?
Yeah, the second part of the question is a much longer answer, but I'll try to incorporate both. Raw data, and this is sort of addressing both the technical use and the investment application. PRI did a survey in 2018 of 1,100 professionals on how they're using ESG information. The majority, it's qualitative, but increasingly we are seeing heavy quantitative use cases to develop risk and exposure portfolio lenses, using the data that they get from third parties at the subcomponent level. So not the ESG score or even the E, the S, or the G score, but the underlying components that feed into that overall score, understanding where they harmonize across frameworks like SASB and others and with other data sets to ensure that they are prioritizing the right type of data that can allow them to make the most informed and sort of poignant decisions that could, in some cases, adjust their DCF model, could lead to really effective engagement with company management on these issues, and to really get a deeper sense of where they want to prioritize doing their own primary research. This is some of the ways that SASB standards overlaid with third-party data sets can really create incredibly useful and powerful applications of data for all types of different investment functions throughout the chain. To the second part of your question, Svetla, how are the SASB standards determined? Just to put it very quickly, it was a 7-year process. It was evidence-based and market-informed with the input of investors, companies, academics, other subject matter experts. So this is not SASB sitting in a dark room deciding what we think is and is not material for each industry. This is us running a fully transparent process where we synthesize the feedback of the market, ensure that these issues connect to income statement and balance sheet factors and would be of interest to the reasonable investor to inform their investment making decisions.
Awesome, thank you, Jeff. And now let's turn into the technology side of things. There was actually a survey ran by BNP, I believe, that found that 66% of those who are interested in ESG investing cite data integration as the key barrier to actually going ahead and doing it. So Balaji, can you talk to us a little bit about the technical side of things, and how can we help investors with the data integration piece?
Yes, right on that, and concurring with Jeff also, which is like that huge number, like 66% of them actually saying data as a barrier. And there are a few reasons, right? First, there is abundance of inconsistent data, siloed data, both in the structured and unstructured form. And then on the second aspect, you also find this lack of transparency in terms of the disclosures. And data providers also have their own ESG scores, right? Some of them use their own black box scoring systems. Then asset managers are looking for they're looking at resource intensive processes. They want to benchmark this, do a lot of analysis, and they're integrating hundreds of data points. So what we find here is kind of a lot of our customers actually saying, hey, this kind of lends into what I could do with cloud-based solutions. And they tap into third-party ESG data. They use SASB model. They go through a data exchange, use a single API to extract that data, extract those signals. And they also use unstructured data, right? They compare with say, for example, investor transcripts. They apply natural language processing. And in some cases, they use machine learning to actually model the ESG data so that they can analyze trends. They can see where there is momentum and also identify which metrics are actually driving ESG performance.
And thank you, Balaji. And one thing to actually add here is that we are huge proponents of low code and no code ways of analyzing data and doing forecasting using some of our visualization tools such as QuickSight. And we just recently actually published a demo using CSR Hub's rating data and forecasting that into the future in order to identify outliers. And there's actually a session on this with CSR Hub and one of our solutions architects, Colin Marden, that is a part of this conference. So you should attend this one if you're interested in this. Now let's move into the next question. We're talking about raw data here, and we're talking about companies publishing their own data and then layering other types of data on top of that. And so that begs the question, how do we know that the data is of good quality? How do financial services companies address really the disparity between disclosed data versus other types of data? And Jeff, let me turn this to you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would suggest that any disclosed data that hasn't been third-party assured should be treated with healthy skepticism, right? I think that's a completely reasonable approach, and I think in part that is why financial services firms and asset managers are turning to unstructured data. And let's just forget the fact that many companies aren't even disclosing data at all. So think about, there's plenty that don't disclose at all. There's plenty that are disclosing in a way that's inconsistent with commonly accepted standards. And then those that aren't necessarily leveraging the likes of KPMG and others to sort of have that third-party verification and assurance put into place. So I think that it's really vital for any investor to use the mosaic approach, right? What information can you leverage provided by the company, provided by outside sources that are using some of the techniques that Balaji described in one of the previous questions, in order to piece together not only the most valuable content to inform a decision, but the confidence that they have that the information that is being disclosed is backed up by outside sources from reputable third parties that is being synthesized using AI techniques and machine learning techniques. So naturally, that can be somewhat labor-intensive and tech-intensive process, but that's why we're all here, right? Hopefully providing some of the solutions to those challenges. But I think that that's really just a healthy way to approach this while the disclosure environment matures and becomes more consistent and comparable as more and more organizations are pushing companies to disclose consistent with the SASB standards. So there's still a lot of value that can be had in the investment process along the way. But plenty more work to do as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Balaji?
Yeah, I just echo Jeff's, right? Like trust but verify. So you want to be able to verify through additional data sets, use the alternative data and layer it on top of whatever is being reported so that you can identify all those like greenwashing that we often see happening around. So yeah, it's verify, use those alternate data sets, come up with your intuition.
Awesome. And Nate, you're the auditor in the room. Do you get any requests to audit and verify ESG related disclosures?
We really do. And I echo kind of what Jeff said before. You know, we have to have an appreciation for the fact that a lot of this is a new language, right? When we go to executives and we start talking about the difference between scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, right? Or certain elements as it relates to, you know, monetary losses from lawsuits. So it's just a lot of these disclosures for the first time, executives are looking and really thinking of, well, what are my competitors done? How's my benchmarking look? These are numbers maybe we're not comfortable sharing. So they do appreciate a Big Four coming in behind and looking at those numbers and also giving them comfort that they're comparing apples to apples for when they put out these metrics. And, you know, a good example, Svetla, is a lot of this information, because it's non-financial services, it's coming from systems that haven't really had a lot of SOC-like review or controls put around it. Many times we've been given spreadsheets, right? And those are never great situations for controls. So yeah, we're glad to come in. We actually just had our one of our audit clients win ESG Innovator of the Year award for getting assurance around their sustainability report. It was very detailed. We give them a lot of credit for that, and we'd like to think the benefit they received, not just from the investors, which was obviously a positive reaction on the stock, but also just from the stakeholders within the firm and the board, received significant more benefit, you know, than the fees associated with our assurance letter.
Good to hear. So we're coming toward the end of this panel, and I have to cite some stats and ask you the question about the future. So we know that between 2018 and 2020, I'm assuming probably driven by the pandemic as well, the total US domiciled sustainably invested assets under management, both institutional and retail, grew 42%. This is a massive inflow. So currently we have 17.1 trillion ESG portfolios. which represents about 33% of US assets under professional management. So these are staggering numbers. And seeing the movement over the last 2 years, we have to wonder, so what's going to change in the future? Like, are we expecting that all portfolios are going to be ESG, or what do you think is going to change, and what are some of the opportunities here?
So one of the things we see, like from a technology perspective, I think data and insights have become the key, right? Especially you're seeing an ever increasing amount of data, but you want to be able to get those insights. So what we are seeing is a lot of things happening around like harnessing clean data from reliable data providers and also adhering to standards. So that's one aspect. But then we also see in terms of what we see is also applying automation, both in terms of capture, the reconciliation. Like, for example, we would see wider adoption of these IoT devices in the office spaces and other places around. You'll also see process automation through like robotic process automations. You'll see a lot of these coming into play. I think, but the key thing is to be able to use the right tool for the right job when you're doing those analytics. Like you have your raw data, maybe what you want to use is an analytical data warehouse in this particular case, or maybe it's nested structure. You want to be able to use a graph database to analyze that data. And so using the right tool for the right job will be key. And what I'm also seeing is increasing use of AI and machine learning, right? Especially with NLP, the natural language processing, there is so much that we're seeing happening, and it's just ever increasing.
Yeah, I always find those statistics to be very interesting because it encompasses a couple of things. One is, I guess you could call them mainstream asset managers that are now beginning to integrate ESG factors into their investment processes. So it's not necessarily net new inflows, it's really more repurposed AUM that is now described as ESG integrated. And secondarily, this whole idea of a label of being ESG is sort of a false pretense in some ways, because ESG it's just information, right? It's information that is pertinent and relevant to a company's operation. And this trend will only continue because the amount of intangible assets that drive company valuation has only grown and grown and grown. And those are largely encompassed and affected by ESG related issues. So a prudent investor would be wise to think about these factors in a really thoughtful and sort of deliberative way, backed up by reputable, consistent, comparable data. So this number, depending on how it's calculated, irrespective of different methodologies, is going to continue to grow. Because I think that there's more and more academic research out there that proves this point. There's more and more pressure from asset managers with explicit calls to action from folks like Larry Fink, folks like the Maple 8, the largest Canadian pension systems, as well as other very prominent asset managers like the CEO of State Street Global Advisors, for instance. So this is only going to continue to happen. I think that what will sort of necessitate down the road as well is what is appropriate from a fund labeling standpoint to ensure that investors are not being misled, particularly retail investors. And similarly, I believe that there will be continued disclosure and continued quality of data sets that integrates into all different functions within an investment operation. So really excited for that, because I think it's not a fad. This is really here to stay. This is just sort of the new normal in my view.
I really like that thought and point of let's get your ESG architecture in place now, because the reality is that if you wait, it just makes it almost that much more difficult. There have been a couple of times this year already I've been in on ESG strategy or engagements where the data executive will say, well, we just don't have a way to capture if we've worked on a green deal or we've made an investment that helped, with PPE investment or a COVID, consideration. Having that ability to capture it so it can start to be reported and companies can take credit, improving your narrative is key. But I also think there's a really great piece of research put out by Morgan Stanley last week, Sustainability Finance. They said that passive ESG investment has grown 75% compounded since 2018. And of the 117 new funds, ESG funds that came out, 75% of those are in Europe, right? Again, so embracing those standards, the EU taxonomy, continuing to push a higher level expectation of data and quality. And then here in the States, we're starting to see our banks starting to disclose ESG metrics in a 10K, which I don't think can be over exaggerated. That's just remarkable, right? For decades, the adage was, if it's not FS, don't put it into the 10K. But I think now we've crossed that Rubicon of these numbers are in here. So if they're going to be eligible for comfort, you need to have the same rigor and control around them to make sure there's no risk of needing to do a refiling or revision, because that can be a double-edged sword as well from a stakeholder and investor perspective.
I think we have time for just one audience question, and I am finding an interesting one here that kind of touches on the whole issue around labeling investments as ESG. So the question is, can you provide us some color as to the various investor motivations to purchase premium ESG securities? And so let me break this down a little bit. First off, what is the reason why there is a premium? And then let's talk about the returns. And can you give us some examples of particular types of deals? And Nate, let me turn it over to you since you work with those types of customers.
Gladly, yeah, it's a topical question. So I'll give you an example, Svetla, from a very recent solar securitization. We were involved in the attestation work. There is more capital chasing these trades, chasing these CUSIPs than we have CUSIPs to sell our investment banks can underwrite. So the ultimate impact is that if you have a bid book that's 6 times to 8 times oversubscribed, if the company guidance was they're going to raise the bond at a 3% coupon, ultimately the bonds can get knocked down to a coupon down to 2, 2.25, 2.5. Now the benefit is that company gets a lower cost of funds, less interest expense. They're more likely to come back to the market with a subsequent deal to accelerate their origination because they've been rewarded with that. But then what happens to the 5 or 6 buyers that bid on those bonds and weren't able to secure them, right? Many of these buyers, many of these asset managers are under ESG mandates, or a certain percentage of the book needs to be filled. So they're going to be that much more aggressive. So while we kind of have this supply and demand imbalance, and there's a relative dearth, I think is a fair way of putting it, of certified green bonds, and we're thankful for the Climate Bond Initiative and the ICMA for continuing to adapt and expand and give us more, to bring more supply to ESG hungry investors. We think this demand imbalance is going to be here for a little while as the market continues to catch up. A great opportunity for issuers, especially.
Thank you, Nate. So that was just one type of deal example. Jeff, can you give us a more industry-wide view into the returns on these ESG portfolios?
Sure, and just to sort of piggyback off of Nate's comments, he focused on green deals, but there's also a massive growth in sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked bonds. And those are outside of specifically using the proceeds for an environmental opportunity. And that cuts across all sorts of different types of industries and sectors. And the guidance from the ICMA and the guidance from the LMA in the principles that they each released, I believe in 2019, is that to leverage content that's already in your annual reports and ensure that the information is material and core to your business operations. So being able to leverage SASB disclosures as a useful KPI by which you determine a threshold that can tie to improvements to your cost of capital is something that can be really, really powerful for issuers, as well as Nate clearly articulated, of interest to investors to get capital. I just wanted to sort of expand on that fixed income use case, but there's a ton of research out there that shows highlighting meta studies. So synthesis of studies of sample size of north of 2,000 studies showing that good performance on financially material ESG issues is likely to have, at a minimum, a neutral effect or a positive effect in 88% of these studies. So if you apply that to your investment process, and there's tons of academic literature around this from Harvard, from recently NYU has a really great study that just shows that there is no give up if you are simply integrating these considerations into your process from a risk and return standpoint. In fact, in many cases, ESG integrated portfolios protect better during drawdowns. So all sorts of different literature around that I'd be happy to share with anybody who would find it interest, depending on your asset class and your investment strategy.
Awesome, thank you, Jeff. And last but not least, let's talk about cost. of managing these types of portfolios. Obviously, more data is coming in. There's more number crunching. There's more analytics. Balaji, from a technical perspective, does this actually cost more? Can you talk about that aspect?
Yeah, so and you all know, like with asset managers, there's a lot of margin compression. So there's always this need for like, hey, how could I do more with less? And so cost plays a significant factor. And we see with ever increasing volumes of data, having to store all of that data, trying to do those analysis, that's where like kind of cloud comes into the picture, where customers are able to actually scale up, right? They have some data, they want to get to the insights quickly, scale up the infrastructure, do their analysis, whatever they need to, and then bring that infrastructure back down. So that way, they save on the capital expenditure that they would otherwise incur by having to store all of this information, buying all of that compute. So that's why we see a big cost lever when they're moving on to the cloud. So that's another reason we see that as well.
Wonderful. Ending on a positive note around cost savings. Who wouldn't love that? Thank you all for participating in this panel. I hope our audience members know that we're open to receiving your inquiries. You can reach out to all of us either on LinkedIn or just email us. So thank you for participating and have a great afternoon or evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Svetla.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Svetla. Always interesting to hear what you guys have and the insights from AWS. Next up, we're going to look at the PE space and, how is ESG playing into private equity? So I'll turn it over to Vishal at Trevista, and please give us some insights.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, ESG for private equity analysis. Why ESG is essential for better investments. What analytics to use for ESG data, and principal applications of ESG. Joining us for the conversation is Colin Etnire, Head of ESG at BC Partners. And now, please welcome your moderator, Director of the Data Intelligence Group at Trevista, Vishal Shah.
Thank you everyone for joining in. Today we are here to discuss ESG and private equity. I'll throw some light on ESG and asset management industry as a whole. Very specifically private equity. We have a wonderful panelist with us who can throw more light with respect to the entire value chain across private equity, talk about ESG, talk about data analytics and tools that are involved in today. The plan is for us to quickly glance through some of the very important hard-hitting numbers that the asset management industry has taken a very cognizant note of ESG, and then move on to private equity. I have a few questions for Colin. Before I actually have Colin introduce himself, a very, very quick introduction about myself. I've been with Trevista for the last 14 and a half years. We've been in data analytics services space for the last 3 years. We are primarily a finance-focused firm working with private equity firms, investment banks, corporates, entrepreneurs, to help them with their financial and data analytics needs. Colin with me, has extensive experience on the ESG side of the equation and has worked previously with Carlyle and followed that up with BC Partners. I would quickly have Colin introduce himself and then we can move on to the slides.
Thank you, Vishal. As he said, I'm currently at BC Partners. I'm the head of ESG. I started last year in 2020. For BC Partners, it's a London-based private equity firm, but we invest across all of Europe and North America. And before that, for the 4 years prior to that, I was working at the Carlyle Group, which is another private equity firm, in their ESG practice, kind of in leading the integration of ESG over there as well. So thanks for Vishal for having me, and hopefully I can bring some insights from my work to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colin, for joining us. Quick, we'll go through the global ESG market, the importance of ESG, talk about the engagement in ESG, a little bit about where we've been working with our clients in this space. And, given time, we can even glance over a few case studies that I've put together. I'm not going to go over this slide in detail. We've discussed this yesterday. We had some wonderful panels talking about the environmental impact, social and governance impact. And this is no different from every industry that has taken a note of it, same as finance, and considering finance is now exposure to from a public equity investing space, private equity investing space, we have asset managers that have taken notice to the trends emerging in the market and just more sustainable operations going forward. Talking about the global ESG markets, we have 60% of the asset managers, invest in ESG focused data. This is across different, parts of the value chain. We're talking about deal sourcing, you're talking about diligence, you're also talking about portfolio management and gearing companies once even, investors have invested to be more sustainable and to be more ESG focused. 20% annual growth rate is expected, with respect to the ESG focused theme and ESG focused investments. Over the last 2 years, we've seen over 100 billion, being raised in ESG funds. We have 2,400 plus investors signed up for responsible investing. And we have just in the ESG focused data, we are talking about $1 billion plus market size by 2021. Some stats which are extremely important. This is similar to most of the presentations and most industries that we're talking about. You're on the right side of the government. You're talking about cost reduction with better, lower cost of capital, positive brand image, better performance, an attractive investment opportunity, and investors, actually taking a note of managers that are cognizant and looking at the future, right? Private equity seems no different. You see a sharp increase. 1/3 of all funds or 1/3 of all, private equity teams are now looking at responsible investing. We have 35% in 2019 and only growing. We have 67%, 2/3 of private equity firms now prioritizing UN Sustainable Development Goals. Extremely important. 96% of the firms have conducted ESG, due diligence for risk management. Extremely important. A private equity investment, and Colin will throw more light on this as we discuss, but a private equity investment ranges anywhere between 5 and 7 years, and some even upwards of that. And sustainability becomes extremely important for a private equity investor. Almost 100% of the firms conduct ESG due diligence. And 77% of the firms are also looking at, to comply with the firm policy from an ESG diligence perspective. The 4 major themes that we are talking about is, climate change, water, social well-being. We will continue moving ahead on the Tres Vista value addition part of it. Due diligence and investment, as we've seen, most of the private equity investors are looking to invest in or looking to conduct diligence on the ESG side of the equation. We have the ESG due diligence, where we are focused on, historical performance and also how the company is going to do going forward with respect to adjustments in valuation, survey analytics with respect to portfolio companies' attitude towards investing, towards ESG investing, data-driven ESG scores, something that is, private equity firms are not only doing this while investing in companies, but also keeping an active track of how the scores are changing as and when they become portfolio companies, and active operational decisions are being taken as they continue moving ahead. We're talking about business intelligence solutions, dashboards, and visualization tools that can be more effective with respect to digesting how the portfolio companies are doing on ESG, displaying some of the stuff that we've spoken earlier, ESG survey analytics, data-driven ESG scores into, digestible dashboards is also, extremely important for an associate or a vice president at a private equity firms and to quickly understand how the portfolio companies are doing. Colin, thank you for joining us. Just overall, you've been in the ESG space for a few years at this point of time. Before we deep dive and talk about data, before we talk about, tools or, just the psychology behind, materially using any of these, how would you think, or what, according to you, from your experiences, how has the ESG space, changed?
Thanks, Vishal. It's a very good question because it is a very new space still, and it's particularly new in private equity. I shifted over to the ESG in private equity world about 5 years ago, and even though that's not really that long of a time in the grand scale of things, in terms of ESG, that's quite a long time because, private equity firms mostly didn't have dedicated internal resources back then. Some of them did, and it was certainly a fairly immature practice. We were just developing the tools and the approaches that we had. By 2021, most of the largest private equity firms have dedicated internal resources of some kind, and it's certainly getting more mature. It's the approaches are more standardized. We know quite a bit more. People are more intentional about it, and I definitely think one of the drivers of that is that the broader private equity firm, beyond just the internally dedicated people, understand ESG better than they ever did. And the limited partners, our underlying investors, are demanding it, quite simply. They think it's both a matter of aligning with their values. They want to do these things because it's the right thing to do. But LPs also think that it's just good investing and that it maximizes their financial returns to do a good job on ESG. So with that pressure rising and the cultural moment of ESG rising, private equity firms have kind of adapted fairly quickly, and it's gone from we were making it up as we go along 5 years ago. We're still doing that to some extent, but it's getting closer and closer to a more standardized, mature space in 2021, and I think it will only continue to do so.
Got it. Thanks. From an investing viewpoint, how is this a value system that has changed within private equity firms, or you, from a central team perspective, are rolling out frameworks for deal teams to now look at, or each one has to contribute and effectively come on board with ESG as an investing tool?
Yeah, the investing tool set itself for investors, as I said, that's one of the things that's changing, is about the way that an average deal team person feels about ESG. I think that 5 years ago it would have felt extraneous. 2 years ago, maybe it feels like something that we do because our LPs want it, but not because we actually think it's necessarily helpful.
Right.
I think we're getting to the point where the deal professionals really actually believe that it helps them make decisions in their investments. And I think the challenge on our side is, even if we can convince a deal team that conceptually ESG is helpful, providing them information and providing them kind of perspectives that they actually believe is helpful, like actually meeting that challenge, is what's kind of lacking, or what is more difficult. Obviously, someone can be easily convinced that climate risk may be material to an investment, but unless you can give them an assessment that is helpful and useful and provides detailed, actionable information, then you're not actually getting the benefit of that buy-in. So I think that's one of the things is getting more rigorous standards around what kind of information we're providing,
Got it.
developing a track record.
Right. So it's moving from like checking the box to actually responsible investing as a part of the deal.
Yeah. ESG is simply, as far as I'm concerned, a part of being a good investor, and our investment teams agree with me. As long as it's more about the quality of the delivery of that mechanism.
Got it. Perfect. Just like how technology has helped a lot of the companies, take care of the current times we are living in, and also for a lot of companies, it's worked the other way. They are, embracing technology as a go-to. Have you seen a similar trend with ESG as well?
Yeah. So I will say that one of the challenges of ESG is that if you go through the list of all the issues you talked about, but then the infinite number more, ESG is a lot of different things. It covers a very wide expanse of issues that no one person is an expert in all of them. Even those of us like me who work in an ESG dedicated role, I'm not an expert in every subfield of ESG. So one of the things that's difficult, and by the way, in private equity, we have the advantage of a relatively smaller deal volume that compared to, say, a public equities investor who, may be investing in hundreds or thousands of names overall, and they move through their positions much quicker than we do. So I have more ability to really get to know my individual companies and understand them on a deeper level when I assess them. But technology helps you do two things. It helps you, evaluate a much larger universe of names and much larger universe of companies, and it also can help you cover areas that you're not necessarily as familiar with yourself.
Got it. Perfect. One of the things you mentioned, it helps you assess deals better, from an ESG perspective. how would you divide your time between investments that you've already made and monitoring, their ESG activities, and doing diligence for new companies or potential investments? So how do you think, where do you invest more time? How is your thought process allocated?
That's a good question. When a deal is going on, it feels like it takes all of your time, right? When you're in that closing period of a deal. But I would say that there's slightly more time, I would suppose, I spent on the deal decision, evaluating potential deals than on the management, because the management is a little bit easier to kind of maintain over time.
Right.
But that is a unique advantage to the private equity model from an ESG perspective, is that we mostly take controlling positions in our companies, and that allows us to change the management of those companies to the extent that we need to. And that's really important, because that means that if we identify an ESG risk when identifying the deal and doing our diligence, we can fix it once we get into ownership if need be. So that is an advantage. We do like to take advantage of that. But I think that even if we are taking a controlling position, the time that we have the most leverage, and this is true of all of the other asset classes out there in finance as well, is before you make the investment decision in the first place. So we really do want to have an understanding of the ESG risk profile of an investment before we opt in the first place. And so we do try. That's kind of, in my opinion, that is if you're thinking about generating an ESG program, that's the first place to start. Is in the diligence process about how to make those decisions. Depending on your asset class, it'll look different, but that's the highest leverage moment.
Got it. So you can evaluate the ESG risk. You can even consult companies, that has investor ESG risk that can be taken care of. And longer term, if there is no buy-in, you can even fix that, right? So you're kind of playing on all sides of the equation.
Absolutely.
One of the things you mentioned was that monitoring is easier. Is there anything specific, we have on, in the audience, we have people on both sides of the equation. We have people who are looking to buy specific ESG data, subscribe to ESG data sources. We have people who are essentially looking to, sell to these data buyers of ESG data. So anything that helps you monitor the portfolio companies that you have, easier, or, from a user-friendly perspective?
It's a good question. The problem with, this is probably true of all companies, but particularly since we invest in private companies, we are not handed a bunch of well-curated data on all material ESG issues the moment that we buy a business or are looking at it. We don't have this platform, we don't have like a data set that is just answers every question that we possibly want to have without ambiguity. We have the luxury, given our asset class, of actually spending quite a lot of time investigating a specific company, and we get access to their management and to the data room associated with it. We typically hire external experts to help us diligence those things. It would be much nicer to be able to have some of these pieces of information just readily available. And I think that that's one of the points of development over the next several years, is that more and more companies, certainly in the publicly listed companies, but even in the private companies, to track their own data and report their own data and have better understanding of their own data, so that you don't need to spend huge amounts of money and time and diligence to get the answers you're looking for. And these answers can be relatively elementary. I think a carbon footprint is something that every company will be tracking in a few years' time. But right now, relatively few are. We're encouraging our companies to do so. We did a carbon footprinting estimate exercise this year for the first time, to kind of cover our entire portfolio. But those are the kind of questions that I expect in time. We shouldn't have to go and dig and calculate ourselves. That should be something that a company just tracks in the normal course of business.
Got it. Perfect. You mentioned, with respect to certain data points, that the governance is going to make it better. But are there any specific tools or software that you leverage in this entire process?
Yeah, I should say that in the private markets, there's less coverage. So in public markets, there's more ratings agencies and sorts of frameworks out there. Sustainalytics, MSCI do these kinds of things. Bloomberg have all those. In the private markets, it's more DIY. It's much more about, what you can compose yourself. And that's something that we try to do for our, I just discussed this idea of like, we want to have more data given directly to us by companies. when we're this private equity owners of these companies, we're the ones who have to do that right now. So we're trying to kind of lead by example by doing that. We own a company called Navex that just purchased a company called CSRware and is now branded as Navex ESG that has that is an ESG data tool. There's a lot of different data tools out there and a lot of different approaches, and I think that eventually we will see some kind of consolidate the market and kind of win that space.
Right.
But what the purpose of those tools is, precisely as I said, we don't have systematized universal ESG data collection right now. It's hard for any one person to manage on their own, as I said, in part because the disciplines and the specialties are very different depending on which ESG issue you're talking about. So having a data tool that helps you kind of push out the requests throughout the organization and collect data throughout the organization. To use one small example, your electricity usage across many different plants or
Right.
facilities, for example. Having data tools that allow you to do that definitely makes the task easier. And I think that basically every company will kind of need that sort of system.
Got it. Got it. Perfect. I have one question, before I can take concluding thoughts on, broad level ESG analytics and where the space is going. The one specific question is, especially for our buyers, when you are subscribing to a company or buying that tool or even purchasing that company, what are your 3 or 4 major considerations that you're looking at from, that the tool should provide?
So in evaluating the deal itself, I mean, I'm a big believer that each company has a different set of material issues, that in certain industries, certain things are more or less relevant. Sometimes the supply chain risk is huge. Sometimes supply chain risk is very low. Sometimes the environmental footprint is high. Sometimes it's not. In terms of relatively universal things, though, I always am interested in the carbon footprint, both at the firm itself and then its supply chain. So if you're using the greenhouse gas protocols, scopes 1, 2, and 3,
Right.
I'm always interested in health and safety figures if that's relevant for the business,
Right.
because that is something that is just always connects to the bottom line. A poor health and safety it's bad for ESG and it's bad for financial return as well.
Right.
And beyond that, it's more of an issue of their governance as well. As do they have the capacity to oversee these functions? That last category is the least able to be dataified. You can easily quantify carbon and health and safety and perhaps diversity statistics. It's less easy to quantify how capable the company is of managing its ESG issues, but that's the remaining one that I spend my time on.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you, Colin. Definitely want some concluding thoughts on data, private equity, and ESG. Where do you think this space is going to be in 3 years?
I think that certain things will just be standardized, and I think it will be partially regulatory driven. The EU has been pretty aggressive about regulating, what companies disclose, and I think that as a world, as we move towards a carbon price and a reduction of carbon overall, everyone will be tracking their carbon footprint, and I think that there will be a certain set of metrics, certain topic areas that just everyone will report on in the natural course of business. I think that diversity statistics, specifically around gender, percentage of women in certain roles, that's something that everyone will report on. And I think that the more that companies will have kind of a standard set of data that they have to report on, the more that they're going to have kind of standardized formats or tools to get there. And investors from every asset class will begin to use it, as they already have done. But they will, the credit ratings agencies are starting to incorporate it into their analysis. Insurers are incorporating it into their analysis. Banks, public market investors and hedge funds, private market investors like us, that you'll just see like a certain set of issues that everyone understands they have to report on, just like their accounting metrics.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you for throwing light. Hopefully over the last 20 minutes, we've done justice to data, private equity, and ESG. Some very, very useful, valuable thoughts from Colin. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining us for today's panel.
Thanks, Vishal.
Thanks, Vishal. Always interesting to hear how the PE industry is starting to use ESG and how that's going to look in the next couple of years. We're doing a lot with Ensemble on ESG specifically for the PE space. So if any PE investors want to learn more, please reach out to us. Next up, we're going to have Zara really helping us to look at the ESG rating space. And, we'll hear from RepRisk and kind of what they do and really how this can affect as many things as ETFs or, how you can put real world practicality into some of these ratings. So without further ado, Zara, take it away.
Welcome to BattleFin's Virtual Discovery Day. Coming up next, controversy, risk, and ESG ratings. Taking a deep dive into ESG ratings and looking at the impact of an ESG score. Joining our panel today is Zachary Dan from ACT Analytics, Blake Scott, President of Waste Analytics, Alexandra Milescu-Chichon, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for RepRisk, and Boris Spiewak, Director of Marketing for Thinknum Alternative Data. And now, please welcome your moderator, CEO of GapSquare, Zara Nanu.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on controversy, risk, and ESG ratings. It's a very interesting topic. Even before COVID, we had kind of this agenda picking up significantly on investor radar, on overall company growth and company focus. But I think COVID in particular has exposed a lot of social issues and a lot of environmental issues that are making this such an important topic for today. And I'm delighted to have with me Zach, Blake, Boris, and Alexandra, and engage in an interesting conversation about what's next for ESG ratings and risk and how we can move this agenda into a positive direction for both companies and people and the environment and social governance. So as we talk about this topic, the main thing for us today is going to be around data and how is data helping us shape this agenda. And before we delve into any more details, I think it'll be interesting to cover a question around what kind of data is it that we're talking about? Blake, what do you think?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be on the panel. We at Waste Analytics provide ESG information on oil and gas decommissioning cost, which is an emerging topic. This data is critical to understand as we begin the energy transition so that proper management of these issues going forward can occur, but also so that we can mitigate the environmental risk from past practices. And we're the only provider of this type of data on the market right now.
Yeah, Zach?
Hi, thank you for the introduction. So I'm Zach, I'm the CEO of ACT Analytics, and we use artificial intelligence to collect and quantify ESG signals from the news. And investors use this data to identify investment opportunities and quantify risks. So the news gives the most current insights and unbiased information into ESG events.
Yeah, that's great. Boris, what does data look like for you?
Thanks, Zara, for the introduction. It's great to be here. So at Thinknum Alternative Data, we've been around since 2014 with the idea that as economic activity comes online, new data trails are left behind. So what we do is we index the public web to come up with around 30 data sets covering around 500,000 public and private companies around the world. So in terms of ESG specific data sets, probably our most popular ones are two different employee sentiment data sets that track employee sentiment essentially at hundreds of thousands of companies, as well as a job listings data set that allows our users to keep track of things like gender bias in job listings.
Very interesting. Alexandra, how about you?
So RepRisk is an ESG data science firm. What we do is we provide qualitative research and quantitative solutions on ESG risks. So everything that we do on this topic is through a risk lens. Our data set was first launched back in 2006, originally as a due diligence tool for financial institutions. So clients come to RepRisk at the end of the day because we help them systematically identify, analyze, and then monitor the ESG risks in their business, whether that's in their investment portfolio, in their client portfolio, supply chain, and so on. And I think now we've seen over the last years that ESG risks, whether it's waste issues or whether it's human rights issues or fraud or corruption, these are important because they can lead to compliance risks, reputational risks, and of course to financial risks. So risk management is really the core of what we do, and it's part of our DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm gathering from this question is that we're talking about all kinds of data and it can come from anywhere. I run a company called GapSquare, and we look at gender pay, ethnicity, and kind of anything related to equality and diversity. And we know that that data can come from anywhere. It's not just HR, it's not just payroll, it also impacts finance, it also impacts a lot of other areas. So it's data from all over the place. Alexandra, let's stay with you and have a conversation about where does all that, what data should companies look at beyond kind of glossy reports that are then shelved?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Zara. And I think what we've seen over the last years is that there's been an acceptance and an understanding that the risk part of ESG is an essential part of doing ESG integration. We like to call it like the seatbelt. It's not the whole package, but it's really essential for good risk management. And another thing that's well understood and accepted is the fact that it's important to look beyond company reporting and company disclosures. In particular, from a risk perspective, company disclosures may mask risks. They can also be biased or they can be incomplete. So what we do at RepRisk is take what we call this outside-in approach to evaluating a company on ESG risks. And what this essentially means is that we look at what the world says about the company instead of looking what the company is saying about itself. So what we try to tell our clients is not necessarily whether a company has a human rights policy, although that's important too, but what we're telling them is how in fact is that company managing human rights issues, climate change issues, whatever ESG issue on the ground around the world where that company operates. And there's a lot of data out there. Zach mentioned it before. You know, there's media information, NGOs, government agencies, regulators. We look at a very broad set of public sources and stakeholders, not just in English, but in 20 different languages. And that really helps to cover risks at the local level as early as possible. So to give you a quick example, I mean, a good year before the Volkswagen scandal hit the headlines is with the emissions cheating, it was actually a small German language NGO who published a report about the emissions discrepancies at Volkswagen. So doing this type of work very broadly in different languages at the local level and doing it on a daily basis has really helped to help assess whether companies walk their talk.
Well, I was just going to add, I thought that was fantastic by Alexandra Zara regarding regulatory agencies, because, you know, there are times that news articles are not reporting on risks that are clear issues from a regulatory standpoint. So if you look at what a regulatory agency is managing, those are issues that oftentimes are risks currently being dealt with, but that would be considered emerging by the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's clear from what Alexandra was saying that there was some things and some organizations and pieces of news preempting that kind of situation way before we actually all heard about it. Zach, if we look at kind of the evolution of risk and impact of risk and the volatility it can cause to the company, how fast in advance can companies predict situations like this?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen and show you an example. What we're looking at here is a time series of TC Energy's score. So this is our proprietary score on TC Energy. There's two lines on this plot. There's a fast-moving score, which captures day-to-day changes, and there's a slow-moving score, which acts more like a long-term rating. So the first thing that should jump out is this sharp downturn here. So this corresponds to when the Biden administration canceled the TCXL pipeline. And you can see the conversation starts talking about the focusing on the environmental impacts. And each of these dots on the line represents a news article, and you can see how in the upper quadrant of the downward trend, if you click on the dots, you can visit and see that the conversation is focusing on the environmental event. But as time goes on, the conversation shifts towards the social fallout of the cancellation of the pipeline. So here we notice how many jobs this cancellation affects, and at the bottom of the signal, there's the conversation about how indigenous communities who were dependent on the development of the pipeline were affected. And so what we found was that these ESG signals can predict spikes in volatility. So this orange line here represents the observed volume of the event compared to the news volume that we expect. And the blue line represents TC's price volatility. And you can see there's about a day in advance before you see the spike. And what we found was that these spikes are persistent. They last for up to 3 days. And when you just focus on ESG events, your predictive power goes up. So a big news buzz about a flavor of latte being released at Starbucks, we screen that out. That's not ESG news. And when you screen that out, your predictive power goes up.
So let's stay on the environmental side of things. Blake, data associated with waste management can lead to important decision making in the space, particularly for investors. How are conversations happening around this in those decisions spaces?
Well, there are some very real environmental side effects from the use of oil and gas that go beyond just carbon emissions, and they include pollution of soil and water. One of these wastes is drilling waste, which is the largest solid waste created by oil and gas companies. This waste stream is voluminous and contains salts, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons like diesel. As you can see in the accompanying slide, the contaminants in drilling waste are comparable in concentration to coal ash, and some contaminants and far exceed the concentrations of other contaminants in coal ash. To date, very little data has been provided by oil companies on this waste stream and how it is managed, which include on-site burial, land spreading, and road spreading. Recording liabilities from these waste streams should fall under asset retirement obligations, environmental remediation contingencies, or environmental loss contingencies. Concerningly, these categories are usually not audited. So in other words, potential pollution has been free so far. So investors need that information on this subject to make accurate and informed investment decisions from both a financial perspective and a societal perspective.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting. So besides decisions for investors, I think data like this can also impact decisions around talent. I mean, our purchasing power is being impacted. We decide on where we purchase our services, where we purchase our products. I know, for instance, when the UK government introduced legislation around the gender pay gap and made it mandatory for companies to report their gender pay publicly if they were a company of 250 people or more. A lot of women in a survey said that they will look at those numbers in order to decide where they purchase from services and products, but also where they seek employment. So it's having a big impact on talent. And we know recent reports are also showing that, for instance, over 70% of young people will look at inclusivity and diversity policies and will look at gender pay reports, ethnicity pay reports in order to decide which employer they want to stay with and which employer they don't want to stay with. And that is having a significant impact on the kind of the talent pipeline. What other alternative data streams can investors look at, Boris, besides the data that Blake was talking about?
Yeah, so it's interesting what you just mentioned about the gender pay gap and different sorts of gender regulations that are coming up around the world. So there's some research that suggests, first of all, that job listings, job advertisements are gendered. And second of all, that those gendered job listings have an impact on the sorts of people that companies end up hiring and how much they get paid. So at ThinkNum Alternative Data, we do track job listings for several 100,000 companies around the world. And we have a gender decoder tool that allows our users to look at like a percentage gender biased based on research that's been done that tries to quantify gendered wording. So it's a sort of quantitative way of looking at, you know, how not only how gendered the hiring is at different companies, but also how gendered it is within different departments of those companies, and then compare that not only over time, but also across industries, across competitors, etc.
Absolutely, that's very interesting, very interesting. And yes, we do also encourage a lot of employers to look at the gender decoder, because ultimately, I mean, we talk about risk, and it can be reputational risk, but it can also be risk of talent. So the World Economic Forum, for instance, released a report in November on the future of jobs, and they created a list of 20 top jobs that are on the increase and 20 jobs that are on the decline. And if you look at the gender composition across the two, you will see that the jobs that are on the increase are male dominated and jobs that are on the decrease are female dominated. So we risk creating a kind of future where a lot of the roles are occupied by men, and that pushes women out of the economy, ultimately not benefiting anyone within any space, not employers, no consumers, no companies and businesses. Alexandra, can we go back to you and maybe you can share with us a few more examples of how companies are handling data around this in a good, positive way, creating sustainable change?
You know, the core use case across our client base is similar in the sense that clients come to us because we help them to systematically identify and assess the ESG risks in their business. So if you look at investment management specifically, they're using RepRisk to integrate ESG across asset classes. Our data set and coverage allows for integration not just in public equities, but also fixed income, private markets, infrastructure investments, hedge funds, and so on. So one example that I can share is, is with S&P Dow Jones Indices, who integrated RepRisk data back in 2019 into a special ESG exclusions index, which is tracked by SSGA's, so State Street Global Advisors' very first ESG ETF. And in particular, what's unique about the use of RepRisk data here is that it's used in an innovative feature called fast exit. So companies which have a high RepRisk score, that are high risk from an ESG perspective, are removed from the index and correspondingly from the ETF within 2 business days. So it allows investors to have an additional layer of risk management that acts very quickly. Another quick example that I can share is actually a really exciting research that came out of Bank of America Securities last September, which used RepRisk data and showed that RepRisk data can also be an effective alpha signal. And so it's not just about reducing risks, which is the core of what we do, but this type of data can also be used for outperformance. And they tested our data looking from 2007 to 2020, so a very long data series. And they found that these results were holding across geographies, so emerging and developed markets, across sectors, across large caps and small caps, and across investment styles. So I think those are 2 concrete examples that really show that this type of data, fast-moving ESG risk signals, can help to not just manage risks systematically, but also deliver investment outperformance in some cases.
Brilliant. Thank you. Zach, do you have any examples in terms of talking through again the kind of the evolution and the flow and how we can use historical data to make predictions about what could happen in the future?
So if you expand on this idea and quantify the relationship between today's news volume for ESG events compared to tomorrow's volatility, if you generalize that idea, which we show on the top 30 companies where we have the most coverage, then you see a really strong relationship. So this shows volatile spikes in ESG news correspond to increase in price volatility the following day. What we found is that not only can we predict the magnitude of the following day's price volatility, we are also able to predict to some extent the direction of the volatility. That is, will tomorrow's volatility be higher than today's? Not just will tomorrow's volatility be high. And so this information can be used to reduce volatility in investment strategies, and it's also useful in options trading strategies.
Yeah. So, I mean, in your view then, what does the future of ESG look like, say 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
So I think there's going to be standardization in corporate reported ESG disclosures, and that's going to lead to more consistency in longer term ESG ratings. And I think the alternative data market is going to continue to innovate, enabled by machine learning and geospatial information. The long-term goal is for NLP to be able to read between the lines to an extent when it reads an article and understand connections between events and companies that may not be explicitly mentioned by an author, but that a skilled analyst would be able to detect.
Yeah, Alexandra, if you had a crystal ball, what does ESG look like for you in the future?
So I do agree with Zach in that if you talk about ESG these days, you can't avoid the topic of standardization and regulation. But I think what I think about it and what's more exciting is also innovation, right? So there's a lot of technological advances that will allow us to leverage new data sets to build out ESG risk data in even broader and deeper ways. We're always looking to add new topics, new languages, new sources, but it's the new data sets like what Zach mentioned, geospatial data, satellite imagery, remote sensing, that can really add another level of depth to the data that's being used today. What we like to call it going from sentiment data, so news-based to public source information-based, what we've discussed already. So going from sentiment data to going to sensing data and having something across the board for all of those options. And I think when I think about my prediction for ESG within 10 years, maybe even 5 years, maybe it won't, I think it won't even exist as a separate concept. It'll just be about company analysis, materiality analysis, financial analysis, and ESG will just be a natural accepted part of that without being necessarily this separate concept that sits on the side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of see a lot of those conversations already happening with a lot of large companies kind of shifting the focus from shareholder kind of capitalism focused company drive to more stakeholder engagement and how you view stakeholders overall for a company and their impact on that. Blake, if we can go over to you, what does the future of ESG look like from your point of view?
Sure, thanks. Clearly we're focused on environmental issues at the moment. So as more environmental risks are identified in the public forum, ESG data, we believe, will become more critical in understanding the real value of companies, as I've spoken about earlier, and their impacts on society. This will ultimately make, we believe, economic activity more sustainable, which will assist in addressing the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, brilliant. Boris, if you had a crystal ball, what does the future look like?
Thanks, Zara. I'd actually like to try to share my screen to answer this question. I think there's increased awareness that happy workers can be good for profits. And for several years now, investors have been using employee sentiment data as a valuable leading indicator of future corporate performance. So in other words, they've been using employee sentiment data to try to generate alpha. I think what's changing now and what's going to be very different a few years down the road is investors are realizing that this is also important for risk management in their investments, right? So it's not only about increasing your return on your investment, it's also about managing your downside risk. So what you see on your screen is some employee sentiment data from Coca-Cola and Unilever. But if we think of some sort of recent corporate scandals, right? So I have in mind the Wells Fargo scandal a few years back when they were creating the fake accounts, and eventually the result of that was their CEO stepping down and some large fines, etc. There were very clear signals from their employees months in advance that something was not right. And we have that in our data. Or to take a more recent example, the Greensill scandal that's sort of slowly evolving in the news over the last few days. They're a lender that seems to be imploding. There were, again, some very clear signals from their employees saying that their management was, their management was not highly rated. There were some cultural problems at the firm, etc. So I think what we're going to see in the future is that investors are increasingly going to realize that they can't afford not to pay attention to this data.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the way I understand it, all of the panelists are on the same page in terms of this needs to move up on the agenda and become a more strategic part of conversations within boardrooms, within senior leadership. Our audience is very diverse today, and they're all at different stages in terms of being part of this process. If you could have one piece of advice in terms of where they can start today so that they can start moving this agenda forwards within their companies and using data in a meaningful way, what would it be? Shall we start? Let's stay with you, Boris, on this one.
So our point of view, of course, is based on our clients that use our data, which is mostly, financial services firms, hedge funds, investment banks, all sorts of asset managers. And I think the biggest change is precisely what I just mentioned, right? So they're realizing that there's an element of crisis management to ESG data and to the ESG policies of all companies in the world, not just, you know, investors that are specifically focused on ESG investments. This is going mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. Blake, from your point of view, what is that one thing that people could start doing from today?
I think that investors need to be open to making sure they are realistic about the fact that environmental issues are far greater than what we typically just talk about. I mean, carbon risk is clearly a serious problem for the world that we must address, but there are also other issues regarding soil and water that have to be addressed in order for us to make sure that we're sustainable going forward. And being open to the fact that we all impact our world, and we have to be able to make sure that we're trying to impact it in a way that is sustainable for future generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Zach, it's been interesting to have a conversation today with you about kind of the progress of risk and how it changes and how it has an impact on volatility. What is that one thing that people can do today?
So I think to get started, people need to figure out what they and what their clients want to get out of ESG and how they want to use it as a quantitative signal or as a way to communicate with their clients. I think that the easiest way to get started is to just start trying different ESG data sets, learning about the frameworks out there. And we offer a free trial of our data set. Anyone can go on and just try it without any commitment. And see for yourself, rebuild our experimental results and discover new, interesting and exciting things that it can do.
Yeah, brilliant. Alexandra, your kind of little advice for starting today?
I would say broadly, I would say double down on ESG. I think a couple of years ago, if we were having this conversation, it was like, oh, well, is it going to fall off the agenda at some point? I think 2020 was a seminal year. I think it's clear that it's not going anywhere. It's only becoming more and more important. And I agree with your point earlier, Zara, about the move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. I think we're experiencing that to some extent now. So I think that would be my broad advice. And then I would agree with what Zach said. Take a closer look at data. Look at data that's not just coming from companies themselves. Look beyond company disclosures at this external data sets. And back testing is probably the best way to do it. Playing with the data, modeling it, seeing how it can add value to what companies are already doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think overall, what I'm gathering from the session today is that there's never been a better time and more accessible time and a more transparent time to look at data and understand what the future looks like, a future that's more environmental, that's more sustainable, that puts people's human rights at the heart of everything we do. Because after all, what we're trying to do is build a better world for our children and future generations. And ESG ratings and kind of compliance and risk is a stepping stone that can help propel us into that world. Thank you very much for the panel today. It's been extraordinary to listen to you and hear your thoughts. I'd encourage everyone listening today to get in touch with our wonderful panel with Blake, Boris, Zach, and Alexandra, or myself, and discuss these issues further. And I look forward to having a conversation about this again in the future.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us for the last 2 days. If you happen to be in Sono, Connecticut, please stop by. That's the new headquarters behind me. Special thanks to AWS Data Exchange, and hopefully soon enough we'll be coming to you in a real live event. So hopefully this fall we'll be able to get back and shake hands and see everyone in person.